September 17th to order. We have two planning board members, or one planning board member online, one is missing, and the rest are present. We don't have any minutes to approve.
That's the wrong
Second. I'm pulling up the wrong packet here. You just pull up the right packet. Give me 1 second. There we are. Thanks for your patience, everyone. We have two call-up items. I don't know if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
You're asking if we have questions
or yeah.
Well, I have a thought.
Go ahead.
It's for the second one. I don't know if you want to do them one at a time.
You know, just order-wise, did we skip public participation?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm all over the place this morning. See, David made me nervous. He's in the audience. He's the former planning chair. He made me very nervous. You're right. Public participation first. I think Vivian's online, who can give us the rules of the meeting.
Hi, everyone. I'm joining instead of Vivian this evening, and thanks for pulling up the slides, Thomas. We're just going to roll through the rules of decorum. You can see your screen. Okay, thank you. Great. All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody, this evening. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board and commission members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement processes, you can please visit our website. The following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. These will be upheld during this meeting. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. And participants are required to identify themselves using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. We have in-person and online comments this evening, participation. If you're in the Zoom webinar format with us and you would like to raise your hand at this time to make a comment, you may hover over the raise hand icon down below. And when it's your turn, we'll call upon you and unmute you and allow you to speak. This can also be found under the reactions icon as well. I don't think we have anybody on the phone, so I'll skip that part. And I believe, my apologies, I'm a little rusty. Do we do in-person participation first? Yes, I will allow you, I'll let you guys take that over.
Yes, so we have one person signed up for open comment in person. We have David Ensign. You have 3 minutes to speak. I'll go ahead and pull your timer up here. And please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Oh, all right, you should be able to hear me now. Good evening, planning board members. My name is David Ensign, and I live at 4020 Evans Drive in Boulder. And I appreciate the opportunity to provide comment. I want to thank you for all you do for our beautiful city of Boulder. I'm a member of Better Boulder, a group of diverse and energetic community members who advocate for sustainable and smart development in this beautiful city. Our group sent this letter here to you on September 9th, voicing support for family-friendly, vibrant neighborhoods work that Carl Geiler and the Planning and Development Services team will be presenting during Matters. I was happy to see that the letter made it into the packet, so I won't go into all the gory details in there, and I'll just briefly speak on behalf of Better Boulder. As our members reviewed the progress of this initiative over the summer, we were struck by how well the proposed land use policies align with Better Boulder's mission of fostering vibrant, livable, sustainable, and connected communities. The original motivation for this effort was zoning for affordability, a goal that we think these changes will help achieve. But we also see progress here in moving towards true 15-minute neighborhoods that offer essential services for daily living that are accessible through means other than automobiles. The changes proposed here will be foundational for working on a robust middle-income housing strategy. Boulder's inclusionary housing program does much to create opportunities for those households who are under 60% of AMI. Encouraging modest housing types will help target those important community members making up to 120% of AMI who struggle to make ends meet in our expensive city. We look forward to seeing the city build on this foundation as we address the needs of the missing middle. Having served on the planning board, I was impressed with the scope of the proposal within the guidelines of the current BVCP. I'm hoping that learnings from this initiative can inform the 2025 major update. Timing of this project is especially good, not only from the BVCP perspective, but also it's aligned with the addressing the affordability legislation that is being passed down from the state level. As in the case with any residential zoning initiatives, residents may be alarmed if they fear that the pace of change will be massive and rapid in their neighborhoods. I hope that public can understand that the expected rate of change is gradual. Boulder's experience with relaxing ADU restrictions, for instance, has not led to a sudden proliferation of ADUs. The rate of change has been quite measured as numerous factors influence residents' decisions to reconfigure their living spaces. Better Boulder provides more detailed comments in this letter, as well as some recommendations for future efforts. I hope our thoughts are useful for you as you provide feedback on family-friendly, vibrant neighborhoods. Thanks so much for your time, and it's great to see y'all.
Thank you, David. And that concludes our in-person open comment period. So now we're going to switch back over to online.
Great, thank you, Thomas. Sorry, just one moment, folks. I see a couple of hands online, but I'm just trying to allow you to speak. Just 1 second with my settings here. Okay. All right, we have a couple of folks joining us online that have raised their hands. We'll start with Oliver Dickhausen, followed by Lynn Siegel. Oliver, you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Awesome. So my name is Oliver Dickhausen. I live in Mapleton Hill here in Boulder. And I would also like to comment on the family-friendly, vibrant neighborhoods plan that you all will be discussing later on this evening. And I missed the opportunity to be able to take the staff survey and provide my input that way. So I just wanted to say that I am in support of the project. I think it's going to be a really cool thing if, you know, all of the policies that have been laid out by the staff and the board go into action. The one thing I will say is, you know, I live in one of the neighborhoods that would be impacted by the changes. I live in one of the great neighborhoods that do have a mix of typologies of, you know, apartments, townhomes, single family homes. And it's really great. Everyone here loves how it is. And I would love to see more of it around Boulder. But I would just challenge staff and the planning board to just, excuse me, as these conversations go on, to make sure that if and when these plans get implemented, that the quality of what is built and the quality of the projects lives up to the aspirations of what we're trying to achieve as a community and getting affordability and getting more housing types created. I would really like to see a more enforcement of, say, the neighborhood parking permit programs, because I do sympathize with people that are concerned about traffic and congestion and parking, and that is something that can definitely be improved on in our neighborhood. We do live in the Mapleton Hill parking permit district, and I think there is a need for greater parking enforcement, as well as, you know, making sure that the character of the neighborhoods do still remain the same. I mean, not the same, but similar, similar to the way that people have come to love them and grown to appreciate them. But with all that being said, I'm super supportive of the project. I'm really happy that the city is looking at these things, and I hope it is successful. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Oliver. All right, next up we have Lynn Siegel. Oh, whoops, oh, sorry. Hold on one moment. Oh,
Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you, Lynn. You have 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, these 15-minute neighborhoods, the problem is it's growth any way you look at it. Case in point, weather vane across from the JCC, a whole little city, no services, zero. Case in point, Papilios, all the extra people from 400 units or whatever are there are going to spill into the community, the congestion, the traffic. 2206 Pearl, 300 square feet, does not meet the missing middle. I mean, it does technically, but it's 300 square feet. So who's going to live there for any length of time? And that's how they got their project approved. Just like 311 Mapleton got their project approved based on Brew House. Brew House never happened. You know, that's the way the city of Boulder operates, the way the planning board operates. Dreaming does not make it so. I wish I could be positive about what y'all do, but I'm not. Sorry. This is, you know, I came straight from David Ensign. We're together at the Boulder County Commissioners protesting, me protesting large houses because of the fact that, you know, Marpa House, the model communal housing in Boulder, is now, you know, John Kirkwood just tried to stick extra bedrooms in there. They threw all the students out. You know what they were paying there per bedroom? $1,700 for 3-bedroom, you know, units. 1 bedroom, $1,700. The Millennium, I can not tell you what they're going to cost, but it's big. 930 bedrooms there. It was 250 with the Millennium, and we're losing all the sales tax revenue. The city of Boulder shoots himself in the foot all the time. And it's just not okay. You know, Papilios, this whole development at McKenzie Junction, a whole development is caught inside of 3 freeways, a triangle and 3 freeways. This is not livable. These spaces, you know, the airport, who owned the airport before anyway? You know, the FAA gave us the right to use it as an airport if we accepted the funds to have it as an airport. If we don't have it as an airport, then what do you think they're going to do? They want it in perpetuity, but we're spending the big bucks to fight them. Can anyone fight the FAA about as much as they can fight the USPS? You know, it's utterly ridiculous. Don't waste.
Great, thank you, Lynn. All right, we have one more hand raised at the moment. Chuck Leaf is up next. Chuck, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I just need a few seconds. I'm Chuck Leaf. I live at 4067 Guadalupe Street in Boulder. I'm the president of Naropa University, and since I couldn't be there in person, I just want to let you know I'm
Hey,
available.
Chuck,
if there-
we're having a little hard time hearing you. Could you
Oh.
mind speaking a little bit closer into your mic or something?
Sure. Is that working?
A little better, I guess.
No, let me try this way. Does that help?
I think. Well, we'll try to hear you. We'll just if you could speak up as much as possible, that would be great because we're having a little trouble. Hey, Thomas, you can restart the clock for him. Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize if. Sorry, so this is still not working?
We can hear you. We're
All
just,
right, it's just simply to say that if there are any specific questions about the first call-up item, which involves Naropa, I'm online and I'll try and do something better if you have any questions to be available.
do we have any other?
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. That concludes our public participation portion. We don't have any minutes to approve today, so we'll go to the discussion. If anyone has any thing that they'd like to call up, we've got 2 call-up items for review for the planning board. Laura, you mentioned you want to talk about, does anyone want to talk about the first one, which was Naropa? No? And the second one?
Yeah, I just had a comment, and I'm not going to call this up. 3125 34th Street. I remember when this came to us for concept review, as it looks like some of the other folks here do. And I just want to commend the project team for taking our comments, the comments that you received from Planning Board, and I think also from City Council, and doing just an amazing job on that design. That central open space looks really, really user-friendly. The additional units that are larger is something that we asked for at that time. And even though there were some concerns expressed at that time about whether there was market demand for that, it looks like you have made that happen, that you've decided that there is demand and that you can make that design happen. And I have absolutely no problem with there being 2 entrances onto 34th Street there. I think that I really appreciate that you showed that you considered options that did not create the second entrance. And all things considered, the option that you went with would absolutely be preferred. I would think all of us would agree with that. And really great job. Thank you so much for listening to us. And it looks like it resulted in a really wonderful project. I'm very excited. This is 100% permanently affordable. It's missing middle type housing. It's the possibility of modular construction. Just really great job. Thank you so much.
Okay, no other comments? We will we'll go into
George,
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I do not want to call this up either, but I just had a question. I don't know if the applicant is on the line or available.
Looks like they're in the room, Kurt.
Oh, they're in the room. Okay.
There might be someone online as well.
Okay, sounds great. My question is just, if I'm doing the calculations right, well, the statement from Sophos Barn says part of the objective was to maximize the number of units given the zoning, but it seems like you could have actually done 1 additional unit, and if you'd been able to squeeze out an additional 150 square feet of open space, you could have done 2 additional units. I'm just wondering if I'm reading that right and what the thinking was there. Again, I'm not objecting in any way. I'm just trying to understand.
Thanks, Kurt. Erin Bagnall, Sophos Barn Architects. To answer your question, we could not. We are very, very tight on open space, and so the numbers that you may have crunched might look like you could add another unit, but the distribution of open space that is removed by adding another unit gets rid of that overage, if that makes sense.
Yes, that totally makes sense. Okay, I wasn't thinking about that. Yep. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Kurt. If there are no other comments or questions, we'll move on to our first matters item, which is family-friendly, vibrant neighborhoods update. That's Carl.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, board members. I'm going to pull up the presentation. Can you enable the sharing, Thomas? Thank you. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about the Family-Friendly Vibrant Neighborhoods Project, which is a new City Council work program item for 2024. It'll extend into 2025 and 2026. We expect it basically grows out of the prior zoning for affordable housing project. So I'll talk about a little bit of how it made that bridge to this project and get into the details of the different proposals. These are mostly suggestions that came from City Council at the time that the prior ordinance was being considered as an extension of that ordinance. So as we've been doing the analysis on this project, obviously our guidance comes predominantly from the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, which sets the vision for the city in a number of different areas, including land use. So when it gets to matters of land use, it's our land use code that really is where the rubber hits the road and where the zoning implements the vision of the comp plan. So whatever changes that we make to the land use code have to be consistent with the current BVCP. So in terms of land use, you're all familiar with the land use map in the city of Boulder, all the different colors. There's residential, commercial. We've been focusing mostly on the residential areas of the city as part of this project to look for more housing opportunities, to expand some choices for people, get some different sized units, and look at increasing some housing along transit corridors, and really to kind of move towards the 15-minute neighborhood concept, getting more walkability in the city, getting more housing close to transit so that people can use the transit, and also moving into a future phase of the project that'll look at other, beyond just housing opportunities, also looking at limited mixed use. So I won't go into that so much because that's a future phase that'll be more in line with the updates that are envisioned for the BVCP in 2025. But we do start with this land use map just to give the guidance of what is allowable in certain areas of the city. We're all familiar with a number of reasons why housing costs in Boulder are increasing. There's, you know, the uniqueness of Boulder, a lot of demand to live in Boulder. It's a problem that actually is pretty pervasive across the United States, but more heightened in Boulder. I think also looking at the open space that surrounds the city, the availability of land for Boulder is more limited. So that also contributes to housing prices. So everything's always a trade-off, and it's things that we go to the BVCP to get guidance of what changes to make. But obviously, housing challenges in Boulder is one of the primary concerns that we have to deal with here in Boulder, and it's a focus area of the current BVCP to try to address that. So it's also been on the radar of the state in terms of the housing costs in Colorado as a whole. So you're probably pretty aware of some of the changes that happened at the state legislature this year. So I'm going to briefly go over those. We talked in February about the residential growth management bill that basically made Boulder's RGMS program inconsistent with state law. So that was repealed. But there's other ones coming down the pike that we're looking at. So there's the residential occupancy limits, which basically makes occupancy based on family status prohibited per the state law. It also, so it makes us have to look at our land use code and how we regulate the number of unrelated per each dwelling unit. There's a bill on accessory dwelling units. that says that they should be required in each single-family house where there is a single-family house to give an option of a property owner to have an ADU and not have restrictions that stand in the way of that. There's another one called Housing and Transit-Oriented Communities, which looks at increasing density along transit corridors and also making projects under 5 acres by right in certain circumstances. So that's something that we're also looking into. So we expect to perhaps be coming forward with some ordinances in coming months related to these bills. I won't talk about the Sustainable Affordable Housing Bill, as that mostly relates to housing elements and forecasts for housing in the future. It doesn't really deal with the land use code as much. So I'm going to jump into the background, how we evolved from the zoning for affordable housing project to the current family-friendly, vibrant neighborhoods. So the problem statement that we use for zoning for affordable housing is largely the same for this particular project. There is increasing costs in the city of Boulder, and we recognize that some zoning regulations on the amount of housing that can occur throughout the city can stand in the way or exacerbate housing cost in the city. So we've been looking at it a number of ways. We've passed a number of ordinances in the last year or so that work towards helping us mitigate this issue, like changes we've done to our inclusionary housing, or the changes that we did last year to occupancy and ADUs, and also changing some of the density requirements in our commercial, business, and industrial zones. This particular project is focused more on low density areas and medium density areas. So we've updated the goal for this particular project. As you see it on the screen, this is what we have within the project charter. But basically it's building upon the changes that were made as part of the zoning for affordable housing project, expanding housing choice and supporting transit use by allowing more missing middle housing in the city of Boulder. And it looks mostly at the zones that you can see, the rural residential, or RR, residential low 1, RL1, residential medium 1, RM1, and the residential mixed zone, which is RMX1. So again, making clear that missing middle is not related to the income bracket, but more the housing type. As you can see from going in anywhere in the United States, there's a prevalence of single family housing as well as apartments, but not so much in between. There's a lot of housing that would be more modest size, that might be more conducive to families, in the range of duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, or even cottage courts that fall into that category of missing middle. So there's a lot of communities throughout the United States that are looking to update their zoning to be more conducive to these types of housing. So we're looking at more housing and types citywide, but also looking at our site review thresholds, that some zones that still rely on the number of dwelling units as a trigger, maybe shifting that more to floor area like we did with the zoning for affordable housing project. So these are the goals that we're looking at this particular phase of this project. So there's been a lot of community engagement on these topics, extending from the zoning for affordable housing project. We've heard mixed reviews on this throughout the city. So I've just put up on the slide kind of the divergent thoughts on this. So for people that are in favor of increasing housing opportunities, adding more modest size housing will increase housing opportunities and try to mitigate that rising housing costs and allow people to have more opportunities to live and stay and work in Boulder. It'd be consistent with the city's housing and racial equity goals. We're still updating our racial equity instrument as we do this project, and as we look at different areas of the city. When we did a questionnaire on this last year, more than half of the respondents were generally supportive of allowing duplexes and triplexes in single family zones, but we'll point out that as part of that phase of the project, it was more focused on the housing type rather than actually increasing the number of possible units in those zones, since we didn't really change the density requirements in those areas. So this part of the project is a little different. As far as concerns, we've heard about parking. We've heard that the demand of living in Boulder is so high that, that we probably will just see more expensive housing that we should focus more on in lieu fees or commercial linkage fees, or just requiring deed restricted units. And we've also heard about, concerns about changing character in single family neighborhoods or parking impacts. So we've kind of heard the gamut of concerns about making these types of changes. So just to summarize really quickly what was adopted last year with the Zoning for Affordable Housing project, the focus on that project was more on removing some zoning barriers for more housing in the commercial, business, and industrial zones. So the density limits of those zones were largely removed and replaced with floor area ratio limitations. So kind of capping the bulk of buildings, but allowing more units. So it would encourage more small units in those areas to kind of foster more walkable mixed use areas. We also allowed duplexes and triplexes in the RL, RR, and RE zones, but again, at the density limits that were already in the code. We got rid of the use review requirement for efficiency living units, which are those smaller units that are about 475 square feet. We also looked at parking regulations and any other things that could be relaxed just to encourage more units to be built. So when we took that ordinance to council in the fall of last year, the ordinance was adopted, but council did make 7 suggestions for things that we should look at the time was a new phase of the Zoning for Affordable Housing project and has now evolved into this family-friendly, vibrant neighborhoods project. But I'll go into detail about all of these, but that's where the scope really kind of grew out of, was re-looking at the RMX1 district, looking at the RM1 district, looking at additional housing density in low density areas, looking at additional restrictions for owner occupancy for adding units in the low density areas. Number 5 is looking at perhaps exempting projects that are 100% missing middle housing from the site review process. Also, again, looking at the minimum thresholds for site review and removing those dwelling unit triggers. And then also going back to the incentive in the industrial zones for more residential housing. If you remember from that ordinance, there was an extra amount of floor area that you could get by having residential and light industrial on the same site. Council asked us to relook at that, maybe seeing whether R&D is a good use to include in that, or whether all the uses in the light industrial zones should be allowed with residential, whether that's a good idea. So we've been doing a lot of analysis on these suggestions from council. So I wanted to bring the board up to speed on the analysis, as well as what we've been hearing from the public. So there's a lot to go over in this presentation, I realize. So what I'm hoping to do is kind of get through each topic. If you have a burning question, certainly jump out with it. I'm happy to answer that. But I think I'm gonna focus more on getting the planning board feedback on each topic, just so it's kind of more chewable bites, since there's a lot of details to go over. So just as a reminder of how the city of Boulder regulates density in particularly the low density residential areas. In the low density areas like RL1, the maximum density is 6 dwelling units per acre. The density limit in the RR neighborhoods, the rural residential, is actually less than 2 dwelling units per acre. So it's our lowest intensity zone. When you get to medium density, it's 6 to 14 dwelling units per acre. And then high density is anything that's more than 14 dwelling units per acre. So again, this is specified in the BVCP. So the zoning is meant to implement what is in the BVCP, and it needs to be consistent. So the way that that's been done is through largely minimum lot size or minimum land area per dwelling unit. So in an RR zone, for instance, it's 30,000 square feet of land area per unit. In the RE zones, that was recently changed to, as part of the prior ordinance, to 7,500 square feet per unit, because that would be consistent with the BVCP. So I'll be updating that slide. RL1 is 7,000 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. And then RL2, which is not part of the scope of this project, is actually 6,000 square feet of open space per dwelling unit. I'll just point out that RL1 is not part of the scope of this, number one, because council didn't request it. Number two, that it's a zone that already allows a number of different housing types. Already, it allows townhouses and attached housing. But number three, the majority of RL2 properties are actually in planned unit development. So we've already recognized that there's a lot of challenges with RL2 because every PUD or site review has all different rules. So changing the rules here aren't going to necessarily affect those PUDs unless they go through amendments. So we already have someone hired for a position to do analysis on RL2. So we're pushing out RL2 until we get some more information and do some more analysis on it. So again, coming back to the BVCP, what council has asked us to do is look at it from a higher level and really kind of looking at this language that's in the BVCP that talks about density. So it does set density maximums in the BVCP, but it talks about it being more of an average across an area. There might be areas within a area land use that is higher and other areas that are lower, and as long as that averages out and doesn't exceed the maximum that's allowable. Even though it says that, over time, the city has more conservatively implemented this through doing it through net density. So council specifically asked us to kind of look at it through a different lens of doing it through like a gross density calculation. So the difference meaning that gross density is where you look at a polygon of land use and you just look at that whole land use and you include the public rights of way, open space, public sites, all of the land area. Whereas the way it's been done through the zoning is through net density, where it's just on a per lot basis. So we've conducted a pretty deep analysis on this that I'll talk about. So that's one aspect that we have to look at when we're trying to determine compliance with the BVCP. So this is the section of the BVCP that sets those maximum densities, but it also talks about the characteristics and locations and uses in that, and whatever changes are made to the zoning also has to be consistent with this part of the BVCP. So I alluded to a phase 2 of this project, which will have a component that looks at limited mixed use in some key locations on certain corridors. That's something that has to be explored through the BVCP update. And we'll also be looking at, potential changes to these land use designations as part of that. But the scope of this particular project is really to what kind of changes can be done to get more housing that's still consistent with the current BVCP. So we have gone out to the public and we've gotten some more perspectives. We've attached it to the memo about the changes that I'm going to talk about. Again, we've gotten mixed feedback on these topics of adding more housing. So I just wanted to talk about it from a high level, and then I'm going to go into some of the questionnaire results that we've gotten on each of these topics. So as far as high level, we've been meeting with, Plan Boulder, Better Boulder, Boulder Housing Partners. We had a meeting last night with some affordable housing residents to talk about these changes. So we've been hearing kind of a lot of different thoughts on this. Some of it's very consistent with last year, but I thought I'd share some new ones. So there is people that are in favor of adding housing, is that adding more housing, adding more to the supply of housing will help solve the cost problem and mitigate the jobs housing imbalance. It would allow more housing opportunities for people. Again, we're seeing a lot of families moving out of the city of Boulder because they can't find housing in their price range or sizes that are in what they're looking for. We have a lot of large single family houses or small apartments. So getting something in the middle would be something that might be more conducive to young families that have starter homes. So that's what's kind of led to the name being called family friendly, vibrant neighborhoods. We've seen a lot of families moving out and enrollment in schools has been going down. So this is why it's a priority of councils. Any more units that get added contribute in lieu fees to our affordable housing fund. Housing along corridors can add to the walkability of the city and encourage more transit use. And then on the flip side, we've also been hearing more, comments that if we're going to add any housing, it should be only deed restricted, permanently affordable housing. We've heard the concerns about parking in neighborhoods and changes to character. Some of the comments that have been attached to the questionnaire are very pointed about not allowing more growth in the city. And then on the flip side of that, we've also heard a lot of comments saying that we should go further and we should allow more housing. So we've been hearing a lot from the community on this. There are concerns that, and we've heard this particular concern, the last bullet point, from both sides of the argument, that there is a concern about investors coming in and buying up single family homes, and that could change the character of neighborhoods. So I'm going to dig into the details of each of the suggestions. And then, like I said, at the end of each of these topics, we'll stop for questions and discussion. So the first suggestion that came from council was focusing on the RMX1 zone. So what was suggested was to get rid of the lot area per dwelling unit requirement in this zone and go with just an FAR. So if you reading through the memo, we've offered a lot of caution about making changes to this particular zone because it's basically the neighborhoods that are around downtown Boulder, like Whittier, Mapleton, Goss Grove, or portions of those areas, portions of University Hill. This is an area that was largely developed as a single family neighborhood at the turn of the last century, and then over time became a high density zone. So you have a lot of apartment buildings in these areas. So you have a mix of single family and apartment buildings. But then that zoning was changed because of concerns about traffic and parking in the 1990s, where basically it went back to a zone that's more like a detached dwelling unit zone. So the current requirement is 6,000 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. So what we've been looking at is, would these changes to allow more units, would that be consistent with the BVCP? So again, we've offered caution because this does talk about character of the neighborhood and areas that have experienced impact from parking and traffic. So it's beyond just the numbers. It's finding that the changes meet the intents that are set in the BVCP. Looking at the metrics, this is a zone that has a mix of density, so it's 6 to dwelling units per acre. So we've been looking at changes as, you can't go over 20 dwelling units per acre, but you also have to be consistent with that characteristics and locations descriptor on there. So looking at the analysis, again, this is focused on the purple areas, which is RMX. You can see that the actual densities there are very much in the range that the BVCP sets out. What we did is we did a gross and a parceled density. So gross means just including all the public rights of way, parks, open spaces that are in that land area. And then the parceled is a parcel by parcel that doesn't include the public right of way. And you can see that the ranges in those areas is very much within what it says, 13 to 18, 9 to 14 dwelling units per acre. You can see it gets, with the parceled, it gets pretty close to that 20 dwelling units per acre. So one thing I wanted to point out really quickly is that our land use code in the past distinguished between established and developing zones. It doesn't distinguish between those anymore, but what it meant in the past was established meant an area that wasn't really anticipated for a lot of changes, whereas if it was developing, it would have a new zoning and expect a lot more development. So that terminology was removed by the code with the last BVCP update, but I just wanted to point out how RMX1 was really considered one of those established areas of the city where there wasn't going to be a lot of change. So we brought this caution to council, and we said, the current requirement is 6,000 square feet per dwelling unit. You could go down to about 3,000 and stay within the 20 dwelling units per acre. But again, there would have to be a finding that it would be consistent with, the character of what's out there now. And I think that can be argued because it is a mix of dwelling units already. There's already apartment buildings, and that would be, I think what we're really trying to get at here is, because we're trying to get more missing middle housing, is maybe enabling a property now that's only a single family house to have a duplex or a triplex. We're not talking about big developments of apartment houses. When we talked to city council about this, direction was to go more bold and look at maybe changing that number down to 2,500 per dwelling unit or 1,500 per dwelling unit, rather than the 3,000 that we had suggested. So we've looked into that further, and we've looked at each parcel. So what this slide shows is the properties that are in orange are those that are well over the 20 dwelling units per acre. So they're already non-conforming. But you can see the ones that are in gray are below that. So there is some capacity to allow more units. But we found that if you went below, down to say 2,500 square feet per dwelling unit, that you'd be pushing up against that 20 dwelling units per acre. And that would clearly not be consistent with the BVCP. So we're continuing to suggest the 3,000 figure, but again, offering that caution about the traffic, that language that's in the BVCP about the changing character of that neighborhood. So we've included this in our questionnaire to the community on this. I want to make it really clear that it's not a statistically valid survey like is usually done with the BVCP. It's a questionnaire. It's just one tool among many that we use to get feedback from the neighborhood, but it's also a really good tool to just make the community more aware of what the detailed changes are about and what those changes might look like. So we wanted to kind of show the community that we're looking at existing buildings largely, like trying to encourage conversions of single family homes into more units in this area. So showing that the same height limits, the same bulk plane limits, the same setbacks, the same FAR would apply. It just would enable folks the opportunity to take a house, for instance, and turn it into a duplex or a triplex. And that's what these graphics are showing. The figure on the left shows a single unit, and then the figure on the right shows the same massing, same size, same scale, same design, but as multi-unit. Again, trying to get at that missing middle. So as of the time we sent the packet out, I've actually updated some of these numbers. We've gotten over 350 questionnaire responses. Again, not a statistically valid survey, but these are the results that we're getting. 52% of the respondents indicated a lack of support for this change, and about 36 of the respondents indicated support. So again, showing that mixed reaction to these changes. So that concludes the first part. So happy to answer any questions, and we can jump into discussion.
Thank you for that, Carl. I do have a question or two. First, can you say more about what tool was used for the public input? Was that Be Heard Boulder, or was it a different kind of survey tool?
We used Be Heard Boulder for the Zoning for Affordable Housing project. In this instance, we did an ArcGIS story map questionnaire. So it was a slightly different format, but very similar. The reason we chose to go with the story map is it allows for the imagery to come up in order and for the maps to pop up and kind of tell the story. So people, by the time they get to the questions, they're well informed.
Gotcha. I did have a chance to visit the story map, and it was very informative. In terms of the tool itself, are there any ways to prevent someone from taking the survey more than once?
There are not. So I mean, that's certainly something that we put out there. That again, it's not that it doesn't have the level of accuracy of a survey. I think with at least the Be Heard Boulder, we're able to like filter out some of the multiple responses. With the ArcGIS, unfortunately, we don't have that capability.
Okay. And I did take a survey once where I had to sign in and basically verify that I was a Boulder resident. Does this tool make any distinguishment between Boulder residents and non-residents? And obviously, non-residents also can have a voice, but is there a way to know whether the people who answered it live here or not?
There's no verification of that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
It's been so long. Thank you, Carl. That was absolutely great. So I have a broad question and I have a specific question. When you were talking about the goals, I'm curious what kind of evidence do we have on more modest housing increasing that actually will cause an increase in housing to suit those struggling to find housing? I think that's a question that comes up a lot. Does making modest houses, do we have evidence making modest houses starts to align with the people who can't find housing?
I mean, we have a lot of data about the sizes of single-family homes, especially when we were doing the large homes and lots project. We tallied up the square footage of a lot of the homes in those neighborhoods. So if we're applying the same FAR limits through this project as currently exist, but enable those to be broken up, I think the point is that, you know, we do have the housing study that was done several years ago about people's preferences, like in commuters, about what they're looking for. And I think it showed that some people were looking to get smaller sized units instead of the large single family homes so that they could live in Boulder. They didn't need all the space, nor could they afford it. So is that getting at what you're asking, or?
Not really. And this just harkens back to, you'll hear me come back to this again and again, the affordable component of it. You know, we're seeing with the project on Pearl Street, 300 square feet. Small doesn't necessarily make it affordable. And I'm just curious if we have evidence for some of the statements that were presented as part of the project. And I'm hearing that not really. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about this project is, you know, making it really clear that, you know, a single family house of a certain size is going to have a certain price. And if that was broken into two, even though the two units wouldn't necessarily be affordable, they would be comparatively more affordable than that entire single family house. So again, we're trying to open up more housing options that are going to be comparatively more affordable. I know there's an interest in getting more deed restricted permanent affordability with these, but you know, the one thing about that is that it can actually cause a disincentive for someone to create a unit if they have to, you know, put a deed restriction on it. And also just, we've had market studies done in the last few years that show that when that kind of requirement is added for adding a unit, there's very little incentive for that property owner to create the unit. So I think the push here is to just give incentives for folks to create units, create more opportunities for a person who doesn't need their large house to split it into two and maybe have, you know, a house for their aging parents or things like that. There's a lot of interest, but just when you look at the numbers, there's not a lot of money that's going to encourage them to do it, especially if there's a deed restriction put on it.
Do we have any data that talks about what these plexes, duplexes, triplexes, what they would hit the market at versus we know what the big houses are hitting the market at? And I'm curious as to, okay, we're making all these changes under this big umbrella of affordable. Where are they landing? What data do we have that shows what are these? I mean, we've had developers do townhouses. I mean, right? Sparn, before he was Sofer Sparn, did a lot of townhouses. And, you know, they're basically investor properties. So I'm just curious, it would be, I think, beneficial to understand, where are these going to land in the actual market? And are they actually going to move the needle on people wanting to live in?
Yeah.
Because I think the idea that smaller is going to be more affordable has kind of been debunked across the nation, in that it doesn't necessarily, especially in a landlocked community like Boulder. I'll get on to my second question, and this is specifically to the RMX1 neighborhood, where we've got all of these potentially bigger houses that might become or get converted into multi-units. What I'm wondering about is, given the existing housing stock in those neighborhoods. You know, they're not new neighborhoods. Are we talking about for people to turn them into duplexes and triplexes and are they mostly going to have to be demolished before they can be converted? Because that's a big ask. Those old houses have a lot of limitations.
Yeah, I mean, that is a concern that we grappled with this change as well. And I think, again, kind of lends to the caution we've been bringing up on
Right.
RMX1. We have talked to our historic review staff about this. Obviously, any building that's over 50 years, if it was to be demolished, has to go through a landmarks alteration certificate process. I felt like after talking to them, there was a lot of confidence that, you know, there still could be a lot of protections for these buildings. So I think our thinking with a lot of these zoning changes that we're going to talk about tonight is that would it more be encouraging people to consider conversions rather than tear down and rebuilds. It's zoning type changes that would encourage that.
Right. Perfect. Thank you. Those are my questions.
I just have one quick question on the gross versus parcel calculations. Is this something that you guys have thought about unique to Boulder, or are you seeing that practice elsewhere?
I think as far as I've heard, it's not unusual for a comp plan to be a gross density implementation. It's not unusual.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Carl, thanks. I had a bunch of questions, and I've sent some via email that are kind of smaller. And listening to your presentation tonight, I now have some bigger questions. And I don't want you to think I'm trying to be lawyerly or gotchy, but these are really serious questions. Can you define character as its neighborhood character? What does the word character mean when we use it to talk about a neighborhood and who reside? What does it mean?
Well, I think everyone has a different definition of what character is. I think for me, it might be the architecture of the buildings, the massing of the buildings, the materials that are used on the buildings, the trees along the street, whether it's single family or apartment. If it can be, you know, largely something that looks like a single family but might have other units in it but still looks single family, you know, I think it could be argued that has less of a impact on character than if, you know, we're making changes to allow more FAR, things like that. I think everyone has a different definition.
See Brad
Can
coming
I
up.
jump in too? I appreciate Carl's answer. So Brad Mueller, Director of Planning and Development Services, and I appreciate Carl's answer. And it just, for me, highlights that planning is not a strict science, right? It's not engineering. We don't want to get grossly prescriptive about things because then you get architecture by paint by numbers. And so basic planning principles such as character and walkability and compatibility are the purview of quasi-judicial decision making on individual cases, and we provide those as tools in the toolbox as planners to help characterize things that can be somewhat intangible. But I think we also try to, as professional, break those down into some of the elements that Carl spoke to. You know, I think you can do that, and as planners, we try to be provide some objective professional analysis about things like architecture and density and massing and things like that to bring some precision to it. But it is ultimately a bit of a feel as well. And again, I would encourage us to be comfortable in that point of discomfort because that is what planning is meant to provide.
So I too appreciate Carl's answer because that is, I think the community could benefit from staff and council defining character in the terms that you did, which focus on physical characteristics of the neighborhood, architectural types, trees, things that, yeah. But when I read through the comments that your survey received, and I think about the city's racial equity instrument, and I think about our goals, there are a lot of comments that are not about housing types. They are about people types. It is about renters versus owners. It is about the other versus us. It is about newcomers versus old folk. And I think that as I'm all for these changes, but I'm a supporter of the BVCP in general. But as we go through this exercise, and I think it's an important exercise, I am struck by the variability in the way we apply the terms neighborhood character and the way some community members do. I'm also struck, and I ask, I think Chris Haglund discussed this in the parking presentation the other night, was we use the word impact. And, so we use the word impact as a pejorative. Oh, this will impact me. Well, what is it that's impacting you? So we use this word impact, and is it I'll have a renter potentially living next to me, and as a homeowner, I don't like that. Well, that's too darn bad, especially in terms of federal law and City of Boulder housing policy and so forth. So I would just urge all of us to kind of look at the way we use these things and the assumptions we make about the words neighborhood character and impacts, because it impacts me if I lose my exclusive use of my parking space in front of my house in the city right of way. And it's because, hey, I've always thought that's mine. It's in front of my house, but it's not mine. So anyway, I'm going to stop there, but I just urge us to think about those sorts of, I don't want to be word police. I think we need to use strong, defined words to make progress, but impacts, neighborhood character, sometimes I find them euphemistically really sometimes awful. So,
Mark, can I quickly colloquy on that neighborhood character point? I just want to say I really appreciated in the memo on page 123, in staff's memo, they say, the character of many low-density residential neighborhoods has already changed or was transformed by the trends of older housing stock being demolished and replaced by larger luxury-type dwellings. That is how the character of my neighborhood is changing. All of these 1,500, 2,000 square foot homes are either being substantially expanded or completely torn down and replaced with these 3,000, 5,000, sometimes 7,500 square foot luxury homes. That really changes the character of the neighborhood, especially when the people who buy them don't live there. So would you rather have a renter, or would you rather have someone with a very large luxury vacation home on your street, right? Like, that's already changing. And so I do see that this project would fight against that trend, because it would give people an option to maximize their property value by creating 2 or 3 units rather than one extremely large luxury home.
Yes.
Right. Since we're talking about character, I'll bring one thing up, which I think is a major concern, which is not talked about in architecture, because I don't want to dismiss people's concerns just because your view of character is different than their view of character, right? There are a lot of concerns in the community that we're setting ourselves up for more investors, more people who are not community members, who not have an entrenched interest in this community and a financial interest in this community. And they live here and they work here, renter or not. There is a big concern. So I think when we talk about character, everyone, to Carl's point, right, has a different view. And I think we need to respect the community views on what they are as character. I personally respect the views of people that are concerned about investors buying up homes in our neighborhoods and what that might do to the character of those neighborhoods, because the investors may not have the same motivations that those of us who live in this community and work in this community have.
Okay. Interesting, and I realize this is this doesn't deal directly with the question at hand of the RMX1 zone. I will simply ask, one, investors buy properties and rent them. So, and I was looking at Carl's map, and the last map had a number of zones. That one, a number of plots, segments. Yeah, no, go back. There you go. The orange are already non-conforming. They were over the 20 units per acre, right? Okay, and so now we're down to six units per acre is the max in those same zones that these are now non-conforming.
Well, it's technically 20 dwelling units per acre. These are the properties that are over
the 20. Okay.
Yeah.
So, so by its nature, we're talking about multifamily units. We're talking about apartment buildings. We're talking about sixplexes and stuff in these older parts of downtown and north of downtown and stuff so do we have any objective evidence that we have more code calls in the orange segments, more police calls, more, I don't know, we have more problems in those? You know, here it is, it's like, okay, these are non-conforming. This is not what we want. We can't violate this principle. And we talk about character. And again, it's this whole renter versus owner thing. And by its nature, apartment buildings are investor owned. And so we provide housing for people who rent. And by its nature, that is not necessarily a bad thing. And under federal law, we really can't discriminate in housing opportunities in terms of purchase opportunities. Federal law prohibits discrimination on multiple factors, including, you know, mental health status, medical status, race, anyway, various things. So I'm going to stop there, but I just, again, the whole idea that all rentals are bad, all investors are bad, it doesn't fly with me. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Kurt.
Hi, thank you. And thanks, Carl, for the presentation, or the first part of the presentation. This is great. I have a question specifically about the density calculations and interpretations of those. I'm grateful that we are acknowledging that the BVCP states that the densities are to be determined based on a land use designation, right? It's not based on a particular parcel. It's not even based on a zone. It's not even based on or a particular area of a zone. It's based on a land use designation. But I want to understand better staff's specific interpretation of that limitation. Are you interpreting that as a limitation on the allowable zoned density that can be allowed there, or is it a limitation on the actual density that exists? Because those two are different, because there are properties that are below the density because, for whatever reason, there are properties that are above the density, as we've seen, because it's been downzoned. So how are you interpreting that in the BVCP?
Are you asking about the how we do it today, like under the current zoning?
It comes up because in your presentation, you say that if we were to zone for 3,000 square feet, to allow 3,000 square feet, one dwelling unit per 3,000 square feet, then that would still be consistent with the BVCP density limits. But a lower number would not be. So that makes it sound like you're interpreting it as the zoned density as opposed to the actual density on the ground.
I mean, with any development project, we would be looking at it on a parcel by parcel basis. So let's say the zoning number changes to 3,000, we would look at a property, somebody comes in, it's a 6,000 square foot lot, they'd be allowed 2 units. We wouldn't be necessarily looking at adjacent properties. However, because that change hasn't been made yet, we have to make sure that that numeric change is not going to create a condition in the future where a whole bunch of properties develop and that ends up going over the 20 dwelling units per acre. So that number that we're suggesting is a number that would hold that line.
Okay.
Because if we go below 3,000 or you get to 2,500, and then theoretically every property in that zone redevelops, it would go over the 20 dwelling units per acre and wouldn't be consistent with the BVCP.
Okay, that answers my question. So you're assuming in the extreme case where every single property develops at that maximum density?
That's right.
Okay. Okay. And well, okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Process question? Carl, are you looking for like a nose count of do we support or have suggestions for changes of each of these as we go through, or are you looking for that at the
Yeah,
end?
that'd be great if you could. Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead, Laura.
Well, I would be happy to support what you have proposed. It seems like it is a modest change, but a significant change that would be in line with the BVCP. And if we wanted to go further, we could explore that in the BVCP update. So I'm more than happy to give the thumbs up to what you're proposing for this zone.
I agree with my colleague Laura.
Comment, we're just gonna go down the line. I'm generally supportive of it as well. My biggest concern is the death by 1,000 cuts scenario, where we're putting things in place like the zoning for affordable housing, and now we're putting this in place, and now we're going to reform the BVCP, and then there's going to be something in front of us a year from now which changes this. And so my concern is, I'm supportive of this, but what I'm not supportive of is not allowing for these things to actually do what we're trying to get them to do before we're trying to already amend them again. And so that's my comment around that. Thank you.
I agree with Laura, and I appreciate that brief summary. I would simply add that the question posed in the packet in the RMX1 zone about parking, the note that you would still retain the off-street parking requirement, which I maybe you could answer that very quickly for me. What is the off-street parking requirement?
In this zone, it's by bedroom. So, well, a single family house would be 1. And then if it's a attached housing project, it would be by bedroom.
So if I had a two bedroom duplexes, I would have 4 required?
I think it would be 3, because I think it comes to like 1.5 per bedroom.
So I would certainly, and this is where the integration and implementation of better parking management, better administration of NPPs. Anyway, I think that requirement in modern day core areas of Boulder where RMX is found is wrong. That we do not need 3 off-street parking places, 3 or 4 in the RMX1 zone, which tends to be our densest area along transit corridors, where you might have 2 families, each with 1 car or less. So anyway, and in those zones, you can still ride your bike, drive your car up and down the street, and there's still lots of on-street parking. So I agree with Laura. with the addition of the removal of the parking requirement.
Mark, can I make a process suggestion? Which is that I think it probably is too ambitious to expect this project to modify parking requirements for RMX zones. And so I would think that if this is mostly just about changing what's allowed density-wise in the RMX zones, and we're going to address parking separately. And I think there's probably pretty broad support for some general parking changes in the city. So I would like to
Well, but
separate that.
If we continue to codify the requirement of a bi-bedroom, here we want family type housing, middle type housing, and we're dedicated, and we have a smaller lot size. The impact of requiring parking spaces for 3 or 4 cars for two-bedroom duplexes could totally change whether or not those 2 duplexes get built.
I agree with you. I just think we're going to change parking at a more broad level.
Why don't we
in
each
future.
just give our feedback?
Yeah, okay.
And then we don't have to agree with each other. We just need to give our feedback and go forward. Thanks.
Cool. So I think generally I'm in complete agreement with this. I would just make sure that we somehow begin to get an understanding on, we're putting more units in, where in the market are those additional units going to land? Because, not saying it the same way that George did, but just the idea of, we've got these goals that we're trying to meet, and are we actually getting there, or are we just making changes under an aspiration? So that's my comment, and thank you for putting this suggestion up there.
Kurt?
Thank you. I support this insofar as it goes. The RMX1 areas of Boulder, I think, are really some of the best places, some of the most walkable places in the city, and the best places for having additional units. They're close to downtown, they're close to the Boulder Valley Regional Center, 29th Street, and so on. They're close to CU. They're close to Naropa for as long as it exists. And so I think that certainly allowing for additional units in those areas would be really great. I would support the council recommendation of 1 unit per 2,500 square feet. So a slightly more ambitious goal. I also, based on my question, I feel like we're being really vastly over conservative in terms of how much change actually would be economically viable, right? It's incredibly expensive these days to build anything. Tearing down an existing functional building is very rarely worth it. And I noticed that a council member, I don't know who it was, suggested instead of determining the allowable density based on dwelling units per on lot area per dwelling unit, said determine the total number of additional units that could be allowed in RMX1 and create a cap. And I realize that that would be more difficult to administer, but I think that's how you would really make sure that you remained below the BVCP density limit while allowing for the greatest number of additional units that, again, I think we need, and that this would be an ideal place in which to put them. So that would be my suggestion for what it's worth.
Thanks, Kurt. Carl, you good?
Can I just quickly colloquy on that? I just, I really understand the motivation for Kurt's comment about wanting to make sure we're not being overly conservative and make sure that we are allowing the maximum change that we can for the property owners that want to do it, while not limiting people based on a theoretical, everybody's going to do it, right? Which is what the way it's calculated now is we can't go over 20 dwelling units per acre, even if every single property owner made the change, which we know is not going to happen. So I understand where Kurt is coming from. My only concern with the cap is something that came up when we talked about ADUs, which is basically the race, the inequality of like the race of who gets to do it first and get under the cap, get in under the cap, which is not a very equitable way to do planning. So, because people with more money and more privilege can get it done first.
I concur, Laura.
All right,
Ready for the next
let's
one?
move on.
All right, suggestion 2. So we're moving on to the RM1 zoning district, which is shown in kind of the peach color here. You can see it in relation to the RMX, which is the purple. RM1 areas were generally created, I'd say, around the late 50s, early 60s. They were zoned around shopping centers. So that's where you see a lot of medium density apartment buildings. And in some cases, there's single family homes, but at a higher density in these areas. So again, they're typically in areas that are relatively walkable to a shopping center or around some sort of neighborhood center. Today, the way the density is calculated is it's 3,000 square feet of open space per dwelling unit. So I just wanted to put that out there, and then you can see the description of it, the land use map description in that corner. When we looked at this zone, I would say, like, just to dovetail on the comments about not worrying about the theoretical and not being too conservative, I would say in this case, we kind of looked at this zone in an interesting way because there's a fair amount of the zone that's actually built out as condos, which will likely not, redevelop based on all the ownership entities that exist on those sites. So there's probably quite a few sites, maybe even 2/3 of the entire zone that would likely not redevelop. So we've made our suggestion here based on that fact. So you could make some changes to this zone where you reduce the open space to say 2,000 square feet. It would give some flexibility to add some units. But we have, I will say, been hearing some concerns from some council members and, housing advisory board members and members of the public about reducing open space. It's a concern. But if we were to go to if we could potentially go to 2,000 square feet of open space per dwelling unit, there could be the potential for an additional, theoretically, 800 units in these zones if these non-condo properties were to develop. I think council, when they heard about this, they were generally supportive of the change, but we did hear from a couple, maybe one council member that was particularly concerned about the open space reduction. But you can see we have a table here that shows how we looked at different scenarios. So the one that's highlighted in the peach color is what we're recommending. Just a modest increase of 23% of the number of units that you could get there. So that would be around 2,000 square feet of open space per dwelling unit. So we put that question out to
I'm
the
sorry,
community.
Carl. I'm getting confused between amount of open space per dwelling unit and amount of lot area per dwelling unit. Are you using those terms the same, or are they different?
They're different.
Okay, because the chart says 2,000 square
Yeah,
feet of lot area.
we did that as just because it's very difficult with open space because it's based on the design. It's very difficult to determine the potential number of dwelling units. So we did use lot area just to give a figure of an idea of how many units could be added. Thank you for asking that. Those zones are the ones that are open space per dwelling unit are very challenging. It's why we didn't touch RL2, because it's 6,000 square feet of open space per dwelling unit, and it's very difficult to determine because it's all based on design rather than just looking at a property and figuring out how many units can go there. We just wanted to be able to give that figure out as what, because they're supposed to be generally equivalent because they have to fall in that range of 6 to 14 dwelling units per acre. So this is the imagery that was sent out as part of the questionnaire. It shows, again, an example of same height, same restrictions, except in this case, obviously, it would have a little bit less open space. But you could see a single family house potentially be a duplex, or on a larger site, you could see more units being added in this case. When we asked the question about this particular zone, the respondents were about 54% against largely, and about 35% were for the change. That's pretty much all there is on that one. It's not as complicated as RMX1. So,
All right. Questions?
So, if you had an existing condo, my mother lives over in 30th and anyway, off of 30th in Arborwood. Anyway, and so that, I believe that's in this zone. Is that right? RM in this zone?
Arborwood?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Anyway, it's a bunch of condos, a lot of open space. There's actually pretty dense, but there's a lot of open space. My question, I'm not talking about my mother's condo. I use it as an example. If we change the amount of open space required, would a project like that, rather than redevelop because of all the different ownership, you can't do that, but would a developer be able to come in, or the condo community say, okay, we're going to give up a portion of our current open space and add a building?
Theoretically, they could. A lot of those projects are in PUDs or site reviews. So there would have to be buy-in from all the owners, which that's what adds to the complexity. But if, there was agreement to, lose a little bit of open space, build a new building, add some more condos, and everybody in the association agreed, and they went through an amendment process, yes, they could add units. It just wouldn't be as likely.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Not very practical. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, ML.
So Carl, I think I saw on this one and the previous one that over 50% of the respondents to the survey were not in favor, lack support, and I think on the last one as well. How does that impact? We keep hearing, here's what the council, is proposing and all, but what role does this public input play in shifting the focus or the priorities or shifting anything?
I mean, as with any project that we bring before you relative to changes to the BVCP or ordinances to change the land use code, this information is brought to you to influence your feedback that you give to us. And ultimately, we bring that feedback to council. And then this will influence council's decisions. In some cases, you might see a project get tabled or not move forward, or if there's a lot of resistance. So all of this plays into the process and what ultimately city council directs us to do.
So staff doesn't have, is there not a process in staff's analysis that would then, you would come to us and say, or to city council or whomever, is making decisions, and say, because this significant amount of public input did this, we're looking at shifting this or changing that. It doesn't happen at the staff level? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
I mean, it certainly influences our work as well. I mean, that's why we're communicating it to you tonight, to show you there are certainly concerns with these changes.
But it didn't change anything, is that correct? Did you make changes because it lacked support?
We haven't made changes. We're going to be going to council next month to bring the same information. Council might then make some changes to how far this goes or whether it moves forward. All of this plays a part in that.
So it shows up at the decision making as a component.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
I think it would be helpful if we're going to get into discussing the survey results as they're reported here, that we also look at the same time at the self-reported demographics of the folks who participated in the survey, and that is at the end of the presentation, because I think that's important context for how we interpret these things, and I assume that staff is also looking at that context.
Yeah. I would also say that that as public input is most measured at the ballot box by who we elect in a representative government to serve on council. And I find these sorts of surveys, while I understand it's like, let's get the community involved, they're so problematic because whether, anyway, they're just super problematic because they're anonymous. They aren't resident based. You can enter multiple times. So the value of them is questionable at best and can be misleading in terms of the direction. And I think that's sometimes why we see a disconnect at levels of the ballot box and the online survey about increased density in a neighborhood.
I think Carl's been clear that this is not a perfect survey. And so it's a data point. We need to interpret it as we interpret it. I don't know that we need to belabor it much beyond that. I think it's a data point, and that's about all it is. It's a completely imperfect, non-statistical data point. Great. Other questions before we get into feedback? Why don't we do reverse feedback? Kurt, why don't you go first, and we'll go down the line this way to Laura this time.
What makes you think I have feedback?
Well, at least a thumbs up or something.
I have feedback. I support changing the density calculations from open space per dwelling unit to lot area per dwelling unit. This was totally not intentional that I asked the question under the call up where I was screwing this up. But it does highlight, at least for me, how these open space per dwelling unit calculations are complicated. So that's part of the reason. I will go a little more broadly too and say that if I ran the circus, we would not be requiring private open space, but we would be requiring having basically an excise tax on development for public open space. The best cities in the world have often very little private open space, but frequent and high quality public open space where people can get out, they can mix, they can interact, it uses the land more efficiently and so on. Think of all the wonderful plazas in Europe or some of the great little pocket parks that you've seen and so on. And the open space in these projects, I find, often ends up being private or semi-private or questionable, and therefore it doesn't promote community the same way that public open space would, and it becomes an inefficient use of the land because, if I've got my private open space, well, I'm the only one, or maybe a few other people are going to be using it as opposed to the whole community potentially using it. So that's part of why I support moving to a lot area per dwelling unit calculation, but I would also love to see this idea at some point, this idea of basically a public open space or park excise tax enacted.
So I agree with what the staff has up, the suggestion number 2. What I would like to say additionally is I really appreciate the analysis of what exists relative to what might exist. You talked about the condos and all the multiple. I think that's important information to bring to the conversation so that, it's not vanilla all over the city, right? There's things that belong to an area that are unique that I think help describe what it is, how we might affect the way this area, this zone works out. So I appreciate hearing that part of it. Thank you.
I concur with Kurt for the most part. I simply want to say that, so if the changes that are suggested, I support. The idea of public open space being important, I agree with 100%. I think there's opportunity for public open space that is not necessarily a park that is city owned and maintained, but is a development owned public space that benefits both the residents of that development. And I think the city should require that, in essence, as projects are developed, a condo project, townhouse project, that the open spaces that are part of that community essentially be open to the public. And I know that another development shouldn't be able to count that open space as part of their open space. But I think the message is that the small little private open spaces aren't really the kind of benefit that the community likes, that the community likes bigger open spaces that are programmed, that have tennis courts or whatever it might be, and are available, even if I live across the street and technically that's not my park, but it should be. So that's my input on the open space part.
I'm opposed to this change. I'm okay with the minimum open space that is currently calculated in this area. I think there are, to support what others have said, I think there are developments can evolve to more efficiently use the open space for the needs of that development. But when I think about Boulder and what this town is about for a lot of people, it's about access to the outdoors. It's about open space. It's about the ability to breathe. And it's not necessarily just about the public open spaces that we have, but also the spaces that are unique to the community's development that they live in and their own private open spaces for their families and things like that. And when I think of things that are attractive to families, since that's one of the premises of this project, and why people would want to be here rather than in one of the L towns where they might get a slightly larger accommodation, is also to have some open space. And I think if we remove that, I think we may be compromising the nature of this project. That being said, from a practical standpoint, talking about a very small slice in here, and so I also appreciate you guys kind of putting that in perspective, because we're talking about a small slice of a small zone. So thank you.
So I would support this change, both in terms of moving to lot area and in terms of reducing the overall requirement. And I come at this from the perspective that we are talking about medium density housing in this case, and actually getting a handle on how much open space this is per dwelling. And you think about that in the context of a standard footprint for what we might consider medium density forms, townhouses, duplexes, etc. Already going down to 2,000 square feet. It's a lot of space. I can tell you this is a person who has a 500 square foot yard, and it is a family paradise. So that may be a personal bias, but I think we have a lot of examples of built form in medium density areas where we make do with a lot less open space per dwelling unit, at least in terms of what people use and notice in their daily lives.
I support staff's recommendation to move from open space per dwelling unit to the FAR limit of the RMX1 zone. And that's the proposal, right? What's in yellow at the top of page 118. Mm-hmm. I support it. I think about the projects that we've seen coming through where a lot of the open space just ends up being the border areas, right? And it just ends up being a setback primarily and not anything that is particularly usable because it's already a pretty small area of open space compared to the lot size. So if we can get more dwelling units in our medium density zones in this way, I think it's a good positive change. So I support.
Moving on.
Okay.
Thanks, Carl.
All right, moving on to suggestion 3. So this is where we're going to be looking at the low density residential zone. So this is RL1 and RR. So in this case, we did the same net and gross density analysis, focusing on the yellow areas of this map. So this is like South Boulder. So you can see that the gross and parceled is actually quite a ways below the 6 dwelling units per acre maximum. So even the net density in a lot of the RL1 zones is below the 6 dwelling units per acre. So it does speak to some changes that can allow more housing in these zones that would still be numerically and metrically consistent with that maximum that's in the BVCP. Again, we have to make an argument, that it's not just about the density, but it's also about the description of those areas, the character of the neighborhood. So what we've looked at, and you can see the different yellow areas here, the gross and parceled calculations. We get back to the BVCP that talks about the 2 to 6 dwelling units per acre, but also the fact that it says that it consists predominantly of single family detached units. So what we looked at with both of these zones was basically, not going over the 6 dwelling units per acre gross, but also not enabling a condition that theoretically could go over, like where a neighborhood could go over 50% not detached dwelling units. So that's what's informed our analysis. So we ran a number of different scenarios, looking at, so the current requirement for RL1, for instance, in the table on the top of the slide, is it's 7,000 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. We looked at 3,000 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit, 3,500 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit, 4,000 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit, and 5,000 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. So that, what this table is basically showing is that all of these examples technically could still fall under that 6 dwelling units per acre, but certain scenarios would actually enable an increase that, if it played out over time, would be more than 50% of the zone. So what we focused our recommendation on is the 39% increase, which is over 4,000 dwelling units, again, over time. And what we've been asked by council is to look at allowing more duplexes. So we looked at this and we've produced a number of different maps, scenarios showing all the areas or all the lots that could be eligible under these different circumstances. But again, we're, pointing, the board and council to an increase that's less than 50%. And that's why we've narrowed in on that 4,000 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. When we presented this to council, there was general support for this, but there was some concern. It was a little more mixed on council. There were some council members that felt that, if we're going to allow an increase and allow more duplexes in the neighborhood, again, making it clear that we're talking about the same setbacks, height limits, floor area ratio limits, but just allowing duplexes. The ordinance changes that were done last year, if you wanted to have a duplex, you'd still have to have 14,000 square feet to get to a duplex. In this case, we suggested 4,000. You still fit within the BVCP. But in talking to council, there was a lot of interest in allowing that, but really focusing duplexes on where there's bus routes, really just focusing those, like basically taking that yield and moving it to transit corridors. So since we talked to council, we've done more analysis. And what this slide is basically showing is, if we looked at 3 different scenarios of increase, so if we allowed, say, a 30% increase in the number of units, again, each lot being becoming a duplex, a 35% increase or a 40% increase, that basically correlates to 3 different scenarios, and that's either a 250-foot distance from a bus corridor, a 300-foot, or a 350-foot distance. So it really comes down to is if council ultimately did want to allow this along transit corridors and have a, an increase at these levels. This is what we're looking at. So what we could do theoretically is, instead of allowing duplexes, on a lot that's 8,000 square feet, you could just say that lots that are 300 feet from this corridor that's mapped, shown in the code, you can do a duplex. So it would focus that additional intensity along areas where people can take advantage of transit. So there was some interest in council for this. So I think we're going to go to them next month and we're going to ask them, does this still seem like it makes sense? If so, do you think it should be at 250, 300, 350 feet? Does it still work to allow a duplex on any sized lot?
Is that as the crow, 350 feet as the crow flies,
I
not,
think it'd be as the crow flies.
not around the block?
Yeah, and we'd have to get into the nuance of how it's measured, like from this property line or from the edge of the right of way. We'll probably have to map it out if this is where this ends up going. So that's what we're going back to council with. This is what we've communicated to the community through the questionnaire, again, showing the same massing and bulk of a building, but this time broken up into a duplex. This time, looking at the questionnaire, we got a lot more pushback, I would say. So 62%, the respondents indicated lack of support, 31 indicated support, again, with all the things we talked about with the questionnaire, the multi-voting and things of that nature. But again, I think this is still helpful just to kind of mix this with all the input that we've included in the attachments, mix it with all the comments that are included. I think it does give you a picture of what we're hearing. And that's that topic.
Questions? Go ahead, Claudia.
There we go. Okay, thanks for this one. I think this is going to be a big one for us. I know that supporting transit use is in the project charter that you've laid out, and that many zoning reform efforts around the country have started around transit corridors. And I definitely understand the synergies there from a transportation demand management perspective. I also know that there is significant pushback on that focus on transit corridors from housing advocates because of how that can tend to concentrate the more affordable and accessible housing in areas with the highest noise, with the worst air quality, and with other safety impacts. And so I'm curious if you can share any context on is there emerging best practice around this question for where we should actually be locating middle housing with relation to transit and other amenities?
I think that's a good question. I think, as we do all these things, there's trade-offs. You want to put housing in a place where, you encourage bus, usage, but obviously there's going to be those noise and potential pollution externalities. So I can't think of any studies or best practices that come to mind, but I think in general, everyone always talks about linking land use and planning, and this is one of those examples of doing that.
I can follow up on that. I just, as a thought exercise, I've been thinking about what are other locational amenities, since we are in theory talking about family-friendly housing as part of this project. And transit might be one of them, but schools are something that we talk about in this community. We're losing school enrollment at our schools. And if we're talking about creating housing for families, is proximity to schools something that should be looked at? So just curious why specifically the transit focus, and if there are other possible areas of focus for locating this kind of housing.
That's all feedback we're looking for. We certainly could look at that. I think we put out the option of corridors and there was traction there.
So Carl, I'm wondering how you arrived at the distance, the 100.
We basically, so when I was talking about that table, if we went with a 40% increase, that yield of possible number of units, again, this is theoretical over time. It's shown on the table there as the 4,325 number. So we looked at it from the standpoint of, if we're allowing that amount of increase, what if we, instead of just allowing it throughout the zone, what if we concentrated that along the corridors? So we had our mapping folks actually look at all the active bus corridors and moved all those units along it, and then that dictated the distance. And it came to be about, what we were thinking, around 300 feet when you spread it across the city.
So we tend to advocate for the 15-minute neighborhood. Why wasn't that used? 15-minute to the transit or to the school or to the amenity that we're wanting to bring more people into accessibility for. Why isn't it relative to?
We did consider that. I mean, obviously, like a 15-minute neighborhood considers like a quarter-mile walk. And the thing about that is that once you go to a quarter mile, based on the number of bus routes, you end up encompassing the whole zone anyway. So because there was interest in spreading this across the city throughout the whole zone, and this number of units, that's why it came to that 300.
Yeah, it seems it seems theoretical more than real in my thinking. I mean, if we're looking at, anyway, I'm just curious. So the transit corridor was the one way you looked at creating more density in the low density. Were there any other? I mean, you didn't talk about any others, but were there any others that didn't quite make it to the presentation? Other ways of adding density, other strategies for making density be relative to something?
I don't know that we looked at any other examples. It was more just kind of this number of units and in a location that was conducive to transit.
Right.
I think again, the 15-minute neighborhood discussion, I think, is going to become more prevalent as we go into the BVCP update. So again, we're kind of just at the beginning stages of this project. There could be more, things that we look at as part of the update.
Right. Thanks.
Kurt?
Thanks. First of all, I appreciated Claudia's questions about possible proximity to other amenities. And I think schools is a key one, but other ones might include parks, libraries, rec centers, maybe certain kinds of retail. Really sort of getting at that, the kinds of amenities that are looked at in a 15-minute neighborhood kind of concept, but as you say, with a smaller scale, maybe more like a 5-minute neighborhood or whatever. So that's just a quick comment. My question is, if we're concerned about the verbiage in the Boulder Valley Comp Plan about these land use areas being predominantly single family, why are we only talking about changing the dwelling units, the lot area per dwelling unit, and not the minimum lot size? Because if we change the minimum lot size to the same degree, you could create single family houses just on smaller lots and achieve the same density.
I think the reason we looked at not at this point changing the minimum lot size is getting back at the whole encouraging people to convert their existing single family to a duplex. Because if you maintain the minimum lot size for, like, say, a 7,000 square foot lot or greater, it would keep that building on the site, and you wouldn't have a subdivision that, could encourage them to demolish it to meet setbacks for the property line. So we thought that not tinkering with that lot size would encourage more conversions.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to skip my question for comments. All right. Who wants to start? Laura?
Thanks again, Carl, for the analysis and for walking us through. I'm supportive. I probably think this doesn't go far enough. I'm not particularly concerned that every single person who is eligible to make their home into a duplex will do so. I think it's going to be somewhat rare that people take advantage of this. And while I understand the need to stay under the BVCP cap, just in terms of like dotting the i's and crossing the t's and, you know, not making a change that could theoretically violate the BVCP, I'm not super happy that we have to do that, right? Because I don't think it's actually realistic that that everybody who's eligible to make a duplex is going to do that. That's just not going to happen. I do like the idea of picking a number that is less than 50%. I would go as high as 49%, again, understanding that that's just not actually going to happen. It's not going to get anywhere near 49%. But if we have to keep our nose clean with regard to the BVCP, I would pick a number like 49%, figure out how many units that would allow, and then distribute it. I really love the suggestions from Claudia and from Kurt, looking not just at transit corridors. I do think that transit corridors are a good place to put more density, but also schools, rec centers, parks, libraries, and grocery stores in particular. I would say that those are great places that people want to live near. Yeah, and I also, I like the fact that this will probably concentrate the available lots that could have a duplex conversion to smaller lots, because it's those bigger lots, those are the wealthier homeowners who are probably not going to take advantage of this provision. So, and then if the smaller lots are the ones that do the duplex conversions, they are also the ones that are going to be more affordable and hitting more of that actual lower and middle income market that we are looking for. So I really like this change. I would push it to the maximum in the theoretical sense, knowing that that's not actually going to happen in reality. And again, look at a wider variety of amenities to concentrate the available lots.
Kurt has his hand up. Go ahead, Kurt.
Oh, I'm sorry, that was a stale hand, but I will take this opportunity anyhow. I also support this. I am highly skeptical of how many duplex conversions there actually will be. I think about the house that I live in, it would be impossible. I can't see any way that you could convert my house to a duplex without basically tearing it down and building over it anyhow. So I feel like that concern, I certainly appreciate the desire. I think it would be great if there could be conversions to duplexes. I'm just very dubious that more than a tiny number of those will happen. So based on that, I feel like going to the reducing the minimum lot size would be a better approach. It would actually result, I think, in some additional units on small lots, which would make them significantly more affordable. So that's my suggestion. But overall, I do support this.
Great. Mark, looked like you were eager to go next.
I'm always eager. So I support this in concept overall. I do agree that the practicality and the expectation that we would get to this 40% at the 4,000 square foot, I would certainly say we could take it to the next step, whatever that it was, the 3,500 or whatever the next step up was. That seemed to yield a pretty large potential increase. I think is probably going to yield a very small. There we go. It was 3,500. We jumped from 39% to 73% as a theoretical increase. I think in actuality, it will be quite small. I am opposed to the transit corridor criteria for two reasons. One, the criteria that you've laid out is way too short. I live in an eco-pass neighborhood that we lots of people ride the skip and stuff, and very few residents of my neighborhood that use the skip. I just did some calculating using Google Maps. They're like 1,000 feet, which is to ML's point, that's a 5-minute walk, a 7-minute walk, something like that to the skip. But 350 feet, even as the crow flies, is like a very narrow corridor. So your biggest criteria is like way too narrow. And the other reason I'm opposed to it is the vagaries of RTD. That if you're telling someone, oh, today you could build a duplex, but tomorrow RTD, who we have seemingly no control over whatsoever, decides to change a route, and suddenly their development right is gone. I wouldn't want my development rights tied to RTD's route planning. So I would oppose that as a criteria.
All right, I'll go next. I'm generally opposed to this. I'm okay investigating it in transit corridors. I see this as, and the reason why I'm opposed to it is a very specific reason. I see this as driving land values up in Boulder. I see this as potentially, I agree with Kurt that I don't see many conversions, right? That these are going to be tear downs and builds. And as I've seen in my neighborhood, smaller lots get torn down, larger lots certainly get torn down. I think we have to approach it from a slightly different angle where, you know, we need to be concerned about the large luxury homes going up, but we also need to be concerned about demolishing good housing stock that are family homes today, many of them around $1 million, when what will replace them with a new build duplex could be $2 to $3 million each. And that is a real concern. And I see that happening with this type of thing being put in place. So I would rather us go the other direction and make sure these large luxury homes aren't being built, but also that we're able to preserve some of the housing that's being targeted in this for families, because that remains some of the more affordable. And when you talk about relative affordability, that's relative affordability. There are houses in Newlands right now that are still $1.1 million, $1.2 million. But if they are permitted to redevelop under this and put a duplex under that, for instance, that's going to be a $2.5 million duplex on each side. That's reality. So I am opposed to that from that perspective, that I think we're going to get the exact opposite outcome of what we're trying to achieve with this. Claudia.
So I support this one in concept. And I think, as I suggested with my question earlier, that I do not support limiting this to transit corridors. I think that is not an equitable way to do this in terms of who gets access to neighborhoods, and that a duplex level of density, at least at the level that this is likely to have any effects, is not something that we need to limit to what we call our transit corridors right now.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a tough one. My feedback is that I think you should definitely broaden the thinking on how to create density here, obviously beyond transit. And we've already, talked about the other amenities that might become a reason to bring more people to them. And that could actually be quite dynamic. But, turning a single family home, as other people have said, into a duplex is not an easy thing to do. So that, I think, brings its own set of challenges. But however, if that, well, I don't see the chart up anymore, but if the idea that it's $4,000 per dwelling unit and you've got a, 8,000, 9,000 square foot lot, you could have two houses. They don't have to be duplexes. Then you could have two small houses. It's basically expanding on what the ADU was already proposing, except it wouldn't have the limitations that ADU has. It would enter into the thinking as small houses, not necessarily a backyard house, or not necessarily, a big house and a smaller house. It would change the landscape to say we can have that original neighborhood again, maybe, and have these series of small houses. And I don't know what all would need to evolve in order to make that, rather than a plex, the sort of intended outcome. But maybe expand the thinking so that, oh, let's facilitate it to go in this direction as well.
All right. Anybody else? I think we got everybody. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to react and caution us that I don't know that we have a mechanism for making people stick with small houses, right? Like, it's not a choice between 1,000-square-foot ranch house and tearing it down and having 2 expensive duplexes, or we get to keep the ranch house. That ranch house is probably going to get torn down either way and either become a duplex or a large luxury home. At least that's what I see happening a lot of the time. And maybe if we don't allow the duplexes, maybe the ranch house will exist a little bit longer. But all these houses reach their lifespan, people outgrow them, and they want to expand, and they want something bigger. And there are people who are willing to buy them, tear them down, and make large luxury homes. So I don't know that we have a way to prevent those houses from getting torn down. And then I just also want to mention that plexes are more energy efficient and more efficient in terms of construction materials. They're a more efficient land use than having a lot of small, separate dwelling units. So I'm not against plexes. I like plexes. If people want to do small cottage courts, I'm okay with that too. But from an energy efficiency perspective, sharing walls is more efficient.
Why don't we do the 4th one, and then we'll take a break after we get comments.
Okay. And after this one, the others should go quicker, I think. This one's kind of related to 3 in the sense that because of the concerns about allowing duplexes, you might have a lot of investors come in and buy up the properties. And if they become like rental properties, there's concern about what the upkeep or noise or parking impacts. We've been requested to look at having an owner occupancy requirement similar to what we do with like ADUs right now, where there's like a declaration of use that gets recorded that one of the units would be owner occupied and then the other becomes a rental. There's been some interest in doing this for the duplexes. So I will say that we've done a fair amount of research on this. It's not, while it might be common to have an owner occupancy requirement for like an ADU, it's not very common for another principal dwelling unit. So we understand the concern about, having, trying to keep an owner on the site and also trying to encourage more ownership, opportunities throughout the city. Our thinking, and council has asked us to continue to keep this in the scope of the project. There has been a lot of support from the community for this particular requirement. I think staff looking at it from the level of the goals of the project and trying to remove zoning barriers and encourage more people to add units, that this adding an owner occupancy requirement kind of goes counter to that, that it probably puts another zoning barrier for someone to create another unit. So we've not been recommending this move forward, but despite that, council has asked that we get community feedback on this option. So what we heard is from the questionnaire, about 67% of those that responded were in support of having some sort of owner occupancy requirement. And I will say, just anecdotally, in our conversations with folks on both sides of this particular topic, there are those concerns on both sides, those that are, open to allowing more housing and those that aren't. There is some commonality in this concern. So I'll put that out there. But that's all we have on this one. We included in the memo, where we've seen this. There is a state bill in California that allows a single family property owner to add another unit. And there are some instances of owner occupancy requirements. We've reached out to the communities like Santa Barbara and Santa Cruz. We haven't unfortunately heard back from them about whether they're seeing much interest in it. I will try to reach out to them again and see if I can hear about it, but that's what we have.
Great. Anyone want to start? Any questions? Go ahead.
Thank you for this, Carl. I am wondering, we've gotten some input about, the owner occupancy, and we know, I hear staff's perspective and the community. What I'm curious as to, one of the, and it's not a zoning barrier, one of the barriers for just people, and I see this in ADUs, adding more housing by right, is financing. We're looking at construction costs of up to $700 a square foot. That becomes outrageous for people to invest in their property and create more housing. My question is, as a way to try to retain and gain affordable housing, has inclusionary housing funds we know that there's now a stream for middle income housing. Has that been looked at as a way to help bring money to those properties and bring them then into, the second unit, the one duplex, or however that works, into the affordable housing program with the city, to invest in these rather than invest with the big developer, to invest in these one by one single family owners with that money?
I don't know that I know the answer to that. Do either of you have an answer?
Because it seems that that's one way to alleviate two things. One, you get permanently affordable housing, and two, you actually get it built, built by people that live there. So it would help deal with the economics, and it would potentially hit, a mark on the, how do we grow our permanently affordable housing stock? So that's just a question. I guess there's no answer, but I'd put it out there as a thought.
I have a question. This might be a hella question. I thought when we see projects across the board here on planning board, we're often told that we can't dictate whether something's even for sale or for rent. So how does owner occupancy even play into that? If we can't dictate when something's for sale or for rent, how could we dictate owner occupancy? Because that would imply that it's been sold, right?
Well, I think it depends on how that's set up, but I think you're talking about the site review context, where we also don't have criteria that speak to that on whether or not something is rented or for sale. So there's one place where you can't dictate it, and I think there have been considerations made in not requiring that, I guess. Probably practical and legal.
So just to clarify your answer, I know it's complicated, but are we saying that by reviewing this, that in a site review context, if we wanted, let's say, only for sale residential in Boulder, that's something that Boulder could actually impose?
Mm-hmm.
And then we would have the ability to opine on that? But we just don't now because it's not imposed by Boulder?
Well, I think, one, we don't have criteria like that, but there are also legal considerations that we would have to make. I know that there is a case out there where a city tried to prohibit rental and required everything to be for sale, and it was found to be in violation of the Fair Housing Act.
Okay, well, I think that it helps inform me at least, because I don't, if we, in those contexts, if we can't even, well, I'll save my comments, but I just don't. Okay, got it. Anybody else? Comments? I'll start. I'd love for this to be something that we do, but to the point that I was just making now, I just don't see its relevancy given what we see as planning board. I would love for the majority of people in neighborhoods to be homeowners or renters of people that own in that neighborhood so that we have as a vested interest as possible, because I think there are deep concerns that are driving this, right? There are companies like Blackstone that are now the largest single-family homeowner in the country. And those things continue to accelerate and risk gutting neighborhoods and turning, things like this into Airbnbs and vacant places or things that maybe people don't want. And while I understand people's concerns on this, I'd rather focus on areas that I think are more defensible.
So I'm also not in favor of us trying to require owner occupancy for duplexes. And one of my major reasons for that is because I think it would be a barrier to people actually doing it. So if we want duplexes to be constructed, throwing up barriers that make it more difficult or more expensive to do that is not what we need to be doing. And once the duplex is built, it probably will change hands many times. I do think there is a concern in this country with investors using housing as an asset, as an investment vehicle, rather than caring about a neighborhood. But that is a nationwide problem that's much bigger than anything that we can solve. And I don't think that this would be the right tool for us to try to use to solve that problem. So I am not in favor of trying to impose an owner occupancy requirement.
Kurt, give your hand up. It's almost the same color as your background. It's hard.
Oh, really? Sorry. I should try to change the color of my hand or my background. I am strongly opposed to this. I feel like it is in many ways largely a veiled vilification of renters. And I find that is deeply inappropriate. George brought up a couple of points, one about Blackstone and other kinds of very large scale investors. To my knowledge, there's zero investment by those kinds of entities in Boulder because the economics just don't work for them. The cost, the purchase cost relative to the rental cost just doesn't work. They buy in, sprawling suburbs of Tucson and stuff like that. George also brought up the issue of Airbnb, but that to me is a completely different issue. I strongly think that we should regulate Airbnb, short-term rentals as we do. But long-term rentals to me are a very different issue. It's related to what happens with ADUs under the current or past occupancy requirements for ADUs. So my wife and I built an ADU. We've had a tenant in there for the entire time since we built it. ML knows this very well. And in the past, we've left the city for a while for my wife's work and so on, and rented out our house, and then came back. Today, or under those rules, or under these proposed rules, if we were to do that, in order to rent out our house, we would have to evict our tenant, right? Because we would not be able to rent out both of the properties. And to me, that serves no purpose. It's just harming everybody. And so I strongly oppose this concept.
ML.
So I agree with basically what's being said about this. My feedback would be to, instead of exploring additional restrictions, I would say explore additional incentives. So what can we do that will encourage people to do the things that we say we value and that we want? How can we sort of flip the conversation to take us to how do we get, and the comment I made earlier about inclusionary housing money is I think that there are ways that we can incentivize the outcomes that we're looking for in these neighborhoods, because a lot of these neighborhoods where they're not the vacant homes, people have lived there for decades and decades. And so there is a real desire to evolve with the changes rather than have the changes happen to us. And I think in that light, explore the incentives.
Great. Mark?
So I would be opposed to the ownership requirement as stated here, and I support staff's recommendations, primarily for the reasons Kurt stated in terms of the vilification of renters. It's something that I think is far too common in this town, and it's a changing dynamic in the world, and I'm all for building familial and generational wealth via housing stock, and I think that a broad diversity of people owning homes is an important thing. At the same time, it shouldn't be the only way and method, and those that choose to rent, just like those that choose to not have a car, need to be afforded the same rewards and protections as those. You know, I know we give people a lot of things towards homeownership, interest deductions and that sort of thing. But I think that in general, I think as our youth is mobile and so forth. Anyway, homeownership is not necessarily the ultimate goal. Sheltering people and having affordable housing for people is the goal that we need to focus on.
Still have to go, right?
Yeah. So I also support staff's recommendation here, and I would not support an owner occupancy requirement for any of these changes. I think my colleagues have already spoken to a lot of points that are important to me, including how we value renters in our neighborhoods. I think there definitely is concern in the neighborhoods that I think we should try to reframe as not about home ownership versus rentals, but about creating more stability and neighborliness. And I think the city has already started to do some work in this area around code enforcement and other things that really deal with quality of life issues that people are concerned about, that can happen really regardless of your housing tenure. They have to do with both owners and renters. So I would encourage the city to continue to lean into that side of this issue. I also have some very practical concerns about any owner occupancy requirements and that they're incredibly difficult to administer. And I would imagine easy to game for people who have the resources. And that does create a large and inequitable barrier to doing any of these kinds of housing changes.
Is that good, Carl?
Yeah, thank
Great.
you.
Let's take maybe just a what do you think? 10-minute? Do you guys need a 10-minute? We only have one bathroom in here, so I just want to make sure everyone has time to go.
There's two downstairs. There's one up and
Why
two down.
why don't we reconvene at 8:35 and try to get through the rest of the meeting? Thanks.
Is my screen's not sharing, is it?
I'm not seeing it.
All right. It's still not showing up, huh? Just buying you time, Hella. Would you prefer mine? Yeah, it's true. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, it just says your screen share is loading, but it's not showing up.
You can try. You can always send me the presentation and I can share it and navigate it if you would want to do it that way. Are you trying to share your screen or just the
Yeah, I was
document?
trying to share it. Apologize for the technical difficulties. All right, I'm sending it to you, Thomas. If I can't get it to come up, maybe see if you can.
Okay, sounds good.
Do you want me just to get started without the presentation? Yeah. Okay, so suggestion number 5 relates to something that came up with the original ordinance for the zoning for affordable housing project. And it was an idea of if we want to get more missing middle housing, maybe we could create an exception or an exemption from site review for missing middle housing. We brought this through all the way to council, and council opted to not include that in the ordinance. They wanted us to do a double take on it. So basically think about it more, think about whether we wanted to do it. It basically evolved into let's focus on getting more permanently affordable housing, and instead of that, create an exemption from site review for permanently affordable projects. So when we talked to council in April, there was support for creating an exception that would obviously trying to encourage more affordable projects in Boulder by giving them a process that's not as, involved as site review. And we talked with our Housing and Human Services folks. They do have an administrative level design review that uses similar criteria to site review. So we thought that we could put something in the code that just exempts out 100% permanently affordable projects from site review, but they could be reviewed in that administrative process. So council was in support of that. So I guess the question for planning board tonight is planning board support of that?
I have a question. Can you give us like a practical example? Would be super helpful to illustrate what you're trying to achieve and like what the difference would be. Would be super, yeah.
I mean, it'd be like, I'm thinking of some recent projects like Palo Park, you know, out by Calmia was a BHP project that had to go through site review. There was one up off of 28th Street by the Raleigh Sports that had to go through site review. So, you know, obviously any site review project, it requires time and money, and that, you know, is a delicate balance for particularly an affordable project. So, if we're already applying similar design related criteria as part of this administrative process, it could save, you know, affordable housing developers a lot of time and money, and in return basically encourage hopefully more affordable projects.
When they went through given those, let's take those as example. When they went through that site review process, was there any additional value to enhancing the project from the perspective of staff, or I don't remember those specific projects, but you know, were there any changes made through that process that were important?
I mean, I wasn't involved with all those projects, so I can't speak as an expert, but I can't recall any like major changes with those projects. At least those examples.
I mean, we just saw one tonight that was up for call up, that we saw it for concept review, and it went through site review at a staff level, I think. And then we had the opportunity to call it up and make them do it for us if we wanted to, and we declined. But I do think that the comments that we gave them at concept review significantly changed the design of their project, and it became a much better project. But that may be the exception rather than the rule, right? So I guess I'm just going to give my feedback real quick, if that's okay. I'm in favor of.
Well, why don't we go for questions before, because we're still in the questions phase.
Okay.
Let's know.
I was just trying to speed us up, but I'll.
Yeah.
As a practical matter, this would apply only to 100% affordable projects. Does anyone in Boulder do that except BHP?
It's possible, but usually it's BHP.
And so Laura gives us a good example of how a concept review helped improve a BHP project. Conversely, I remember at Iris 28th Street, this is going up now, there were a number of concerns we had that really couldn't be addressed because of the federal funding nature, like access to the pool. And there's lots of things that federal projects that are 100% permanently affordable, you know, are subject to a whole different set of, they have a different set of constraints, and there are things that we can't constrain in those projects. So I'm just thinking out loud that, I mean, would you think that's a fair characterization, that we can't constrain many projects that are BHP projects in ways that we could a private project paying into the inclusionary housing fund?
What do you mean by constrain? Like,
condition. You know, we said, anyway, it seems like we are more limited in the way we can condition a permanently affordable project using federal funds than projects that don't. Or am I just imagining that?
I think generally they are subject to the same site review criteria as other projects. And then there might be practical limitations, or I can think of another limitation that we're actually going to bring to you very soon, related to some principles and how the financing works under LIHTC funding. But I think that those are the exceptions. That doesn't come up very often.
Okay, thank you.
That reminded me of another project that we had on Plan Board when you were here, Claudia, and it was in Gun Barrel, and there was like a facility, like a shared facility, and we actually kind of gave feedback, I think unanimously as a planning board, to kind of shift around, right, to push it out. So that's another example where I think that feedback was important, probably at least in the opinion of a lot of the people on planning board, could make that project better. So anyways.
A follow-on question. The staff level site review, you would not be eliminating the staff level site review, or is that the proposal? Just like
It would eliminate a site review application, an LUR, a land use review. So it would be basically, there's an administrative review process that housing uses already, where they apply, I think it's the older version of the site review criteria now, but they do evaluate certain projects through that. So it would be putting all of the permanently affordable projects through that process.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, ML.
Following up on that, like right now, do the permanently affording housing projects go through that that staff housing review? Or no, they just come to planning board?
I think most of the projects go through planning board. I think it's when they do like the off-site projects that don't ordinarily require site review, they apply those criteria to those projects. I think those are the ones that go through that administrative.
Okay. And you're proposing that if they don't come to planning board, then they would have to go through that?
Correct.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
So what's the practical, this change, like what does it practically do for BHP is it a monetary thing? What is it? What's driving it?
I think it's just to make affordable housing projects even more feasible, to try to get more permanently affordable projects. If they can save some money and devote that into other things.
Do you think that there's been a BHP project that has not been able to come to the city because of this process? Like,
I don't know.
Are we really solving something?
No, I think part of this comes from, best practices from other jurisdictions that talk about what are ways that you can encourage more affordable housing. It's, exempting them from, processes that may take a long time and take a lot of money.
But this hasn't been an identified issue that has actually stopped any project.
Not that I'm aware of.
Anybody have any questions?
I have a question.
Oh, Kurt.
I guess my hand is still invisible, sorry. I tried to change the color of my hand, but it won't let me. My understanding is that in order to be eligible for Prop 123 funds starting in 2027, we will need to do this anyhow. Is that correct?
It doesn't necessarily say you can't put them through a site review process. It just means that you have to get to a decision within 90 days. So whatever process you're in, you have to get to a decision much faster.
I see. So it can still be, excuse me, it can still be discretionary.
Yes.
I see. Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions? Anyone want to start with feedback? Go ahead, Laura.
So I like this idea in general. I'm in favor of trying to streamline discretionary reviews, have a benefit, and they also have a cost, right? And the cost to BHP is both monetary and time, staff time, that they could be devoting to other projects, right? And there is a limited pool of money that they have. So it might not have stopped any projects that they're trying to develop, but it might give them less funding for the next project. So, and I think saving money for affordable housing is a good idea. That said, I just recommend talking to BHP about it and acknowledging that there is a cost and there is presumably some benefit. Like, hopefully we have made some of their projects better in their own eyes and in their community's eyes. And do they think that that's worth it, right? Or would they prefer not to have to go through the discretionary review process? I think that's really important feedback to get if you haven't gotten it already. If you haven't gotten it already, I'd love to know what they said.
Yeah, I think in general, we've gotten feedback and that there's concerns about the time and cost of the process, but I think I'd like to have more specific, conversation on this particular topic. We have talked about it briefly, so.
I would love to ask them directly, is it worth it? Like, be bluntly, brutally honest. Is it worth it? Is the value that you get from going through this project and thinking about your projects and how they have physically changed because of going through this project, is it worth the time and the cost? Because they care about their communities and they care about the design and the usability by their users. So I think they're really well positioned to give us good feedback on this.
Kurt, your invisible hand is up.
No, yes, thank you. I support this. Every dollar that we are able to save BHP is a dollar that can go into actually creating additional housing, right? So I think it's less on a project by project basis than on a sort of systemic basis in terms of the overall cost to them. I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, I've heard numbers like it costs $500,000 to go to site review for a large project. Whether that's accurate or not, I don't know. I heard that from a developer. But I do think that to the extent, as I said, to the extent that we can save the money, I think that this is a positive. It's, yeah, we make some changes in projects. It's not always clear to me that site review is a net benefit. So I support it.
I completely agree with what Laura said. I think that this is a perfect case of asking the one person that does these and follow that trail.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm torn on this. I think to be perfectly honest, it's like, well, you're on a planning board, right? And you offer up a perspective and insight, and I think it does have value at times. And I also think that the question for BHP was not what does site review cost, but what would the incremental savings be from this staff level review, that if they produce essentially all the documentation and everything required to do the staff level review, okay, planning board, we seem to meet darn near every week these days. So, how many weeks and how many real difference in dollars is saved by doing the staff level review versus a planning board level review. So, and getting those answers, developers love to toss out numbers like $500,000 to go through site review. Well, is that your doc package that you would have to do anyway to get a permit? What is that number? So, anyway, those numbers are tossed about casually. So, I would like more info on this, but I'm not just gung ho for it.
Okay.
I'll go. As a developer that's gone through site review, even went through site review today on something else. Site review, asking a developer if they want to go through site review and if they see value in it is like, asking a fox guarding the hen house what we should do, right? I don't see the value in that, because their answer is going to be, it doesn't have value to us. The question to us as a city and as a planning board and as a city council is, does it have value to us as the city? Have we improved these projects? Is the juice worth the squeeze? To Mark's point, much of the site review process is going to have to be created by the developer either way. Site review just is an additional check and balance or hurdle that that developer has to go through. And when they have to go through that hurdle, and we were able to cite off of memory, forget about all the other things that have happened, 2 projects that have had consequential benefits from nearly unanimous perspective on planning board, I don't know why we would eliminate this unless BHP can really prove out that there is a cost that is driving it to the point where they are not able to produce the housing that they've been tasked with. And I don't think there has been any, certainly there's just been shared tonight, that leads us to believe that. I have heard people complain about going through site review, but complaints alone is not a reason not to support it. And having seen projects improve through that process, and most of those projects go through, I see no reason to change this. But that being said, it's always valuable to get feedback from them, because there's a difference between eliminating something completely and saying, okay, what are the pain points? You know, maybe there are some pain points to the point where there's legislation coming in 2027 where we're going to have to accelerate this process to 90 days. Maybe there are ways that we can make it more efficient to them and still get the outcomes that we need as a city to make their projects as good as they can be.
So I have a number of hesitations about eliminating site review on these projects. I mean, most of all, to say that, you know, BHP, which is the organization doing most of our 100% permanently affordable housing right now, you know, is a trusted developer in the community. They have some very good outcomes, and yet we as a planning board still have had some important positive impacts on reviewing those projects. And, you know, if one of the goals of potentially making this change in site review is to get more affordable proposals in front of us, you know, maybe in an ideal world, it's not just BHP bringing us these projects, but that also introduces other players where I don't think we can make these assumptions about everybody is going to be coming in doing quality placemaking. And I'm actually quite concerned with quality placemaking when we talk about larger developments, and particularly when we talk about affordable developments in the city, because these are somewhat rare places. And just because they are affordable does not mean that they should be cookie cutter. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Just one more quick comment is, I don't know if it's worth exploring. Is there a mechanism for us to do concept review but not site review? Because I think most of our value comes in the concept review stage.
Great. Carl, you said this was going to be quick. I think 5 was longer than I expected.
Sorry. All right. Well, unfortunately, I'm still not being successful here getting the slides up. The next one relates to the site review thresholds. So you'll recall that it's either the size of the site, the floor area being proposed, or the number of units that determine whether a site review is required or not. And quite a few changes were made in the zoning for affordable housing project to eliminate any of the thresholds that related to number of dwelling units and really put it more as floor area, so that it would not create a deterrent from adding housing units. There were some additional zones where we didn't make changes to the thresholds relative to the number of dwelling units. So this project would look at the rest of those zones and change it to floor area. So in your memo packet, we've included the proposed changes and the zones. I do have them on the screen here that I can't share for some reason, but we took this to City Council and they were supportive of the changes to the thresholds to remove those dwelling unit triggers. So we just wanted to get your feedback on that.
Carl, can you clarify when we go from when we go to an FAR from a number of dwelling units and associated open space to FAR. I understand that the idea is you can get more dwelling units. Do you get less open space?
Not necessarily. The open space requirements would still apply when you do a project. It's not going to change the open
But it's
space.
not per unit. Is that the significant
It
difference?
depends on the zone. Right
Oh.
here, we're just like talking about what is actually going to require a site review application.
Right, and so it won't be triggered by, or if it is triggered by number of dwelling units, the fact that you turned them into FAR and not dwelling units will remove it from the process. Is that what the thinking is?
No, it's just that right now it says in many places in the threshold that if you do 5 or more units,
Right.
you're automatically in a site review. So instead, we would just change that to a floor area. If you're building this much floor area, you're in a site review project. So when we
I
talked
see.
about this
I
last year,
Mhm.
board member Norbic would remember that we considered an average of 1,500 square feet per unit. So instead of doing it based on unit, we just did 1,500 times 5, and that gave you a number. So in this case, we're talking about doing similar type changes where it'd be 7,500 square feet of floor area instead of the 5 dwelling units. So again, to not make it so it's a deterrent for doing housing units.
If I can jump in, I think I remember a case where for a building of a certain size, if they did 5 large units, they didn't have to go through site review. But if they did 10 smaller units in the same size building, they would have to go through site review. So the idea was don't disincentivize having more units
Exactly.
by creating that site review trigger based on number of units,
That's
but
right.
base it on the size of the building.
Yes.
Is that jogging? Okay.
And we're also proposing to lower the threshold for the BC zones and the industrial zones so that at least more projects would have the option of doing site review. Because sometimes, developers want to go through site review to have that flexibility. So we're looking at changing some of the triggers to just give that flexibility. So reducing the acreage minimum for when they would elect to do a site review.
Questions, or can we go to feedback?
Can I follow up about the minimums?
Yeah.
My question is, why do we have minimums at all? Especially for the IG and IM zones, for example. If someone wants to take a very small lot or do a very small project, but do something really different and they want to go through site review, why are we blocking them?
I think there's certain zones where the way it's set up in the code, it's generally in the more established areas, like as I was talking about before, the older areas of the city. We don't want to see site reviews popping up on single family dwelling sites all over the place. We don't want to have a prevalence of PUDs, on these like 14,000 square foot lots. So there were certain zones where there is a minimum to discourage that, because those are the areas also where you tend to, instead of getting a modification to a setback, it's more appropriate that that type of site would go through a variance process where there has to be hardship based. But I think mostly we don't want to see a whole prevalence of site reviews on really small sites that aren't really appropriate for the site review process anyway.
But my question was primarily about IG and IM, which seems like it's a different kind of situation.
Oh, you're asking why do we have any kind of acreage minimum there at all?
Right. Specifically for IG and IM.
I mean, I think based on what I was just saying, I think there's an argument to maybe changing that to 0 so that any site could come in. I might have to think about that a little bit more to see if there's any issues with that. But
okay, thanks.
All right, should we go to feedback? I'll start. I haven't started. I'm okay with that.
I'm good with eliminating the number of units as a criteria and going to floor area.
I also am in agreement.
I'm looking at the changes proposed. It's on page 134 of the staff memo, if anybody wants to look at the specifics, and I'm thumbs up. And I think that, Carl, thank you for offering to consider Kurt's suggestion of not having a minimum in IG and IM, and I think that's a great suggestion for you to explore.
I'm happy with all of these.
Kurt, did you already give your your invisible hand?
Same, Laura said I made a suggestion. It was just a question, but I am making that suggestion. So thank you. And I support it.
All right, great. Last one.
Last one. Okay, so this I'm hoping is pretty simple. So for the zoning for affordable housing ordinance, we wanted, or council basically asked, how can we encourage more residential in the industrial zones? But how do we also make sure that residential doesn't drive out light industrial uses? So to thread that needle, we proposed a change that would give basically a floor area bonus for residential floor area if a certain percentage of the site remained or was built as light industrial. So basically, if you do a mixed use project in the industrial zone and you keep 0.3 of the floor area as light industrial, you would get a bump in your residential floor area from 1.0 to 1.25. And we went out to some developers and they sounded interested in that, and that could incentivize residential and incentivize either the creation of light industrial on that site or your mixed use. So that was supported by council and it was incorporated into the code. So it's now in the code. But then council looked at it again and thought maybe there's issues with incentivizing more research and development type uses since we're already seeing a lot of interest in that. And they asked us to look again at whether that's a good idea. Like, should we include R&D in the list of uses that we want to incentivize for the industrial zones? And after re-looking at it, I think staff continues to find that there's reason to encourage research and development. We have a lot, we're known for R&D and startups in Boulder, so it seems like something that should be supported in the industrial zones. But it did make us look at a lot of the uses there, and we started thinking maybe there's some light manufacturing uses or even bigger manufacturing uses that would be incompatible with residential uses that we shouldn't encourage them together. So we came up with a revised list of uses that you could have on the site to get this residential bonus. So we brought this back to council. They were supportive of the list. The list I have is, residential mixing with business support services, building material sales, warehousing or distribution facility, wholesale business, light manufacturing, building and landscaping contractor, equipment rental and repair, non-vehicular repair and rental services, and service of vehicles. We felt that on a larger site, you could mix these uses and those would be appropriate uses. We felt that the other uses that are listed in the light manufacturing category in the use standards were probably not appropriate to encourage with residential. So we're proposing to just narrow that list down. So council was good with that list. We just wanted to hear from you on that.
So just to clarify, so this is just modifying uses that are already been approved. This is not changing any additional thing.
Correct.
Since we're modifying uses, my question around the uses that are permitted, because this is always, it's so nuanced as to how you view these things. Is office in any way included in that light industrial, or could it be interpreted that way by who's building it? or has it been excluded in a way that you find satisfactory that we won't get essentially office workers in this space?
Office is not included in the list. It would only be those offices that are either considered administrative offices, which are accessory to an industrial use, or an office that actually falls under the R&D definition.
Thanks.
Can you expand on, we've seen a mighty lot of R&D projects. So what is this office that falls under the R&D? How is that different from the big R&D projects? Are they the same thing?
Oh, just anything that comes under the definition of R&D, there's going to be components of those R&D uses that are going to have an office component. But if it becomes a full office and it's not R&D, it's going to fall under the office definition. And it's not going to be subject to this.
No, so I guess I'm thinking about life science buildings. Would they fall under this?
Yes.
And so how does this, so the ordinance already exists, you're just amending to add the R&D in essentially?
No,
and
the R&D is already in.
It's
It would just be, it would actually just be narrowing down the list.
narrowing down the
Narrowing
list.
down the list, but also raising the question again about whether R&D should be one of those uses.
And you decided it should,
We decided it should. We're suggesting it should.
right? So does keeping it in, does it in any way impact the ability for industrial to have enough opportunities in Boulder?
I mean, R&D is now listed as a industrial use.
Right, but you said you were
might
rethinking it.
compete with other industrial uses. I don't have a
Oh, I
specific answer.
I
but
see what you're saying. So when you were asked to reconsider if R&D belongs there or not, what was the reason to reconsider?
I think because of the fact that there have been a lot of life science uses coming into Boulder and maybe it doesn't need to be incentivized.
And you decided it did because,
I think our thinking was that, again, Boulder is kind of known for startups and those types of businesses. So we would encourage that. And also encourage those particular types of projects to have residential. They might have a big parking lot that they could build some residential on.
right, it's encouraged with the bonus, but it's not required.
Right.
Thanks.
I've got a question. I thought I understood this, and then I was listening to you, and I thought, no, I don't understand this. So currently, the ordinance allows, or gives a bump in the allowable floor area in industrial spaces. And that we have that list, industrial spaces, and we have the list of things that are allowed. And now we're talking about adding R&D.
No, R&D is already
R&D is already
allowed.
there. So this list on page 137 which list, below is a list of uses that would not be eligible for the increased residential floor area mixed use.
Those uses are now eligible to
They
get
are.
that bonus. So we're proposing to take those uses out.
So the only thing we're actually talking about doing is narrowing the list. We're not talking about expanding the list. We're talking about narrowing the list. Okay, so on page 137 of the packet, cold storage locker, outdoor display of merchandise, outdoor storage, self-storage facility, general manufacturing. Now, how do we define, and this is where definition of words gets really important, general manufacturing from light industrial use?
Let me look that up for you. We have it defined.
Okay, you know what, I won't make you define it. Anyway, okay, recycling center, recycle, okay. I would, yeah, okay, now I understand. Thank you.
Other questions? Feedback? Maybe just Kurt?
Yeah, first of all, I support retaining the ability for R&D to get the bonus. I think that R&D and residential can be compatible. I don't know how often it would happen, but I think it shouldn't be prohibited. I think I trust you on the list of things to remove. Just one very minor detail. I saw building and landscaping contractor listed in both lists. So both keeping it in and taking it out. So just FYI. But overall, I support this.
I'll go. Yeah, it kind of makes sense. I kind of voiced my concern in my question, which is, you kind of mentioned it, which is like the idea of, for instance, let's take a startup life sciences business who's got, Series A funding of $30 million, and they take down a space at $40 a foot just because they can, and they outcompete light industrial that we need as services, as residents of Boulder. That's where my concern lies. I don't know how you're like already kind of nitpicking uses and things like that. So I think in general, I'm supportive of that. I would just like us more to like revisit this in a few years and say, are we getting the outcomes that we want as a community? Because I don't have any issue with it specifically, except for that concern of just uses outcompeting, services that we need as Boulderites.
I would say that as long as we are in the context of allowing for residential uses alongside light industrial, that the question to be asking is which are actually compatible uses in terms of land uses coexisting relatively peacefully next to each other. And in that case, that yes, R&D is a potentially compatible use. And I also agree with your list of unfriendly, non-compatible uses. These all seem to make sense as things people would not want to live next to.
So once again, I go back to when we were doing the use tables in the East Boulder Sub-Community Plan. And you guys had a consultant put together this nice, straightforward graphic descriptions of what uses were allowed. And I found them to be way too prescriptive and narrow. And so, for instance, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Green Guru. Green Guru collects bicycle inner tubes, other used sporting goods, etc., and repurposes those things into various consumer products. And they are a recycling center. So, and they are at 47th and Pearl Parkway in a light industrial building. They are emblematic of what we would want to preserve, right? But we wouldn't, by this list, they would not be an appropriate tenant in a mixed use building that had residential. So the developer, if they're going to redevelop the space, and those metal shed buildings will get redeveloped someday. So again, more than anything else, I find that the city of Boulder generally tries to put way too fine a point on uses, and the market, if you're going to have a cleaning and laundry plant that smells of chlorine all day long, etc., the market isn't going to really support much housing upstairs from that facility. Conversely, I don't know, living above a cold storage locker sounds quiet. I mean, there's not much there, right? I don't know why would you say no to the residential bump above a cold storage locker? I don't know. So I guess if you're asking, do I support narrowing the list? No, I don't support narrowing the list.
I would say I'm generally supportive, although I do appreciate the point that Mark just brought up that I had not thought about yet, which is, you know, does the city need to regulate this or will the market regulate it on its own? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it bears thinking about. But generally speaking, I think that these seem reasonable. And I mean, I think that the ordinance that we're modifying here is a great one, right? It says, hey, we're going to try to incentivize people to retain these light industrial uses by giving them additional residential capability. And so hopefully it's a win-win, both in terms of retaining light industrial businesses and in terms of getting more residential out of it, right? So I think this is really great. So from that perspective, do we want to narrow the possibilities of who could potentially take advantage of this, or do we want to rely upon the market to figure it out? Is a great question, I think.
Yeah, I think this is one of those that it's good in principle, but I think that it could be challenging in practice. And I really appreciate, you know, the input that check it out in a couple of years and see what's happened. Because I think, you know, again, my concern, as I said before, is what's going to happen to the small industrial in some of these, you know, moves to create housing. So, yeah, I think good in principle, challenging in practice.
All right, well, thank you for the feedback. In conclusion, I just wanted to talk about next steps and then I'll be done. So we're going to continue with community engagement on this. We do look to do some like office hours once we have like a draft ordinance put together. Right now, I mean, it really depends on the complexity of the changes. We're going to be going to City Council on October 17th. We'll convey the community feedback. We'll convey the feedback that we've heard from Housing Advisory Board and Planning Board to Council, and then they'll tell us what to do with each of these suggestions, and we'll begin the work on the draft ordinance. Right now, we have a pretty quick turnaround to get this done. We're looking at potentially coming back to Planning Board in November. But again, I think it's going to really depend on the complexity of the changes after we talk to City Council, but ultimately bringing it through Council in like January or February is kind of what we're aiming to do. So that's the next steps.
Great, thanks.
But thanks again
Thanks,
for all
Carl.
the feedback.
Thank you, Carl. Thanks for taking us through that. All right, I think we have one more matters item, right? On my agenda.
I think the last matters item is just an informational item that was sent to you to keep you informed. If you want to provide any feedback, you're welcome to, but there's no planned presentation.
Okay. Yeah, I had sent that. So basically, FEMA created a new map that the city has to adopt. So it just requires a change in date in our land use code. So there's a link to the ordinance for that. But it's not required to come to Planning Board, but we felt it prudent to inform the board about it.
I'm opposed to changing the date.
I'm opposed to your opposition.
So that concludes things except for calendar check and any other thing that we need to hear from anybody. Like Brad has something.
Well, I just want to thank you for the really robust conversation on a really difficult topic with a lot of nuance, and appreciate your taking time to be aware of all that nuance, and to Helen, Carl, and all the staff that have continued to work on. This is not the low-hanging fruit, right? The low-hanging fruit was, I don't know, in the 80s or so. So this is pretty far up the tree now. So thank you for your time. We're going to keep it coming at you for the rest of the year. So thanks for being available.
I just had a comment about this project, and it got me thinking about, so this whole project refers back to the BVCP. And so when we say, gee, we want to increase opportunity for middle housing, missing middle housing. And we say, well, okay, how can we do this? But everything we do has to conform to BVCP goals. And I am a BVCP champion fan, love it. But then I get to thinking about that we have this partner in the BVCP, which is the county. And our ability, so in this plan changes mildly every 5 years and substantially only every 10 years. So as our goals and the interests of the city progress, we're really tied to the plan that we've adopted. And I don't mind being tied to those plans. And I asked Brad, maybe it was even a year ago, I was like, why do we have the county at all in this plan? And Brad gave me a really good answer about, well, it helps us to create boundaries about where we can annex, where we can expand, those sorts of things. But this reminded me, and recent county, both interactions just as a citizen and as an applicant and stuff with the county, reminded me of just how different the county is from us, and their interests are from our interests. And this plan that has to be adopted by the county commissioners and the county planning commission is directly affecting the decisions we make about the number of units per acre in the core of the city of Boulder. So I'm going to get to a question here, and that is, why don't we take the opportunity as we develop a revised Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan to limit where the county has input? So if I think about a Venn diagram,
Yeah.
instead of being this, 2 circles, 100% overlaid, and everything has to be approved by all 4 bodies, why isn't it like this, and that the 4 bodies approve the areas of mutual interest? And we're talking about RMX1
Yeah.
zones downtown. What does the county have to do with that?
Yeah, I think, and we'll be able to articulate this better when we're starting to bring some of the comp plan items forward. But I think you'll find it really is the Venn diagram that overlaps. So while it is a single document that is for body approval, there are numerous sections that articulate that for things that are in the city only, the city will determine X. And so there's a lot of articulation of that. And I think we'll be able to clarify and demonstrate that.
I think you guys have been outperforming the county by leaps and bounds in
We're not
your
allowed to comment
operations.
on the record for that.
Huh?
We're not allowed to comment on the
Okay.
record.
Of course not. But anyway, you're getting it from, I'm allowed to comment. So I'll just say you guys are ahead by leaps and bounds.
I just wanted to add a quick item that I think is germane to the discussion that we just had about family-friendly, vibrant neighborhoods. Point of information, I wanted to share that my community, the Wild Sage Co-housing community up in Holiday neighborhood, just celebrated its 20th anniversary over this last weekend. And that was a pretty big deal for the residents there, both past and present. We had a lot of former residents come back and visit. But I think also a bit of a landmark for the city, because the surrounding Holiday neighborhood, which is also now 20 years old, was really considered a national model at the time that it was built. And a lot has changed about affordable housing since then. The economics of that model have changed quite a bit. But in terms of the built form that we have up there, which is a lot of what we were talking about tonight, it really remains a great example of how middle housing can support families and community here in Boulder. And it was just on my mind because I know Holiday neighborhood comes up a lot in our public discourse around housing recently. And I wanted to extend an invitation to any of my fellow board members or members of staff who haven't been up in the neighborhood for a while to join me for a walkabout anytime that you would like to. So please reach out if you're interested.
Very good. Thank you.
Hey, Thomas, I think we were supposed to give you feedback as to who was available for a bonus meeting. Did you get what you needed from us?
Yes, for that October meeting on the second Tuesday.
Yeah.
I heard back from, I believe, 6 out of 7 board members that they would be able to attend that.
Great.
So I don't think we need to do a formal vote on that.
If you want to, you can.
I don't want to unless we have to.
Well, your procedures are a little bit out of date on when the meetings are happening anyways.
Are you saying if we want to, we can add it to the calendar, or if we want to take a vote about adding it to the calendar?
If you
we can
want to take a
formalize it
vote
with
about adding to the calendar, you can. Otherwise, we'll interpret you making yourself available as consent.
Sounds good. Great.
So the meeting is on, is what I'm hearing.
Yes, and that is for October 8th.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Thomas, and just one suggestion to ML sent an email the other day asking certain meetings retain their tentative date, tentative note on the calendar, even though they seemed to be a for sure thing. Is that, anyway, I'd love it if.
Yeah, all of those are updated through the fall now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, ML.
And I have one other question. Are the December and beyond meetings going to hybrid only?
No, that was also just a old
Okay.
format on the December calendar. That's
One
been
never knows.
corrected
We're all
now.
going to be in foreign countries, so we may as well come.
Thank you.
Anybody have anything else?
Yeah, just quickly, since Hella brought up the board procedures, do we know the status of the update of those?
Yeah, Mark actually brought it up at our agenda meeting as well, and I spoke with Laurel about it, who's taking the lead on those. She's gonna look at the calendar with Charles to try to find a time to fit it in. The calendar is pretty full, but hopefully we'll get it done sooner rather than later.
Okay, sounds great. Just wanted to know. Thanks.
Great. This meeting is adjourned.
Bye all. Thank you.